Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're going somewhere very far away, but not in space, in time. 66 million years backward, to a world that felt infinite, lush, and alive with creatures that would one day become myths. The Cretaceous Period, the last age of giants, the twilight of the dinosaurs. Before we drift back to that ancient landscape, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Is it late evening where you are, the kind of night that feels like it could stretch forever? Or maybe it's early morning and you're just easing into your day, curious about a world that ended long before ours began. Wherever you are, this is your moment to slow down, breathe, and let your imagination walk through a forest that no human has ever seen. If you find this journey soothing, or even just a pleasant way to wind down, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like or subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of calm reach others who might need a little escape too. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let the world around you fade. Because we're about to travel to a time when Earth was warmer, wilder, and far stranger than you might think. Imagine an afternoon somewhere on the Cretaceous Earth. The air is thick with moisture, heavy with the scent of plants you wouldn't recognize. Giant cycads rise like green towers, and flowering plants, the newcomers of evolution, spread across the undergrowth, their petals attracting insects that have only recently begun their intricate dance with pollen. The hum of wings fills the air. Dragonflies the size of small birds dart over shallow pools, and beetles glint like living gemstones beneath the sun. You can almost hear the distant bellow of something enormous moving through the forest, the slow, deliberate rhythm of footsteps that shake the ground. This was not the chaotic volcanic world of early dinosaurs. The Cretaceous was a world of refinement, of balance, a stage polished by millions of years of evolution. The continents, once clustered together in the supercontinent Pangaea, were drifting apart, shaping oceans and coastlines that would one day become familiar outlines on our modern maps. North America was split by a shallow inland sea. Europe was a cluster of islands. Australia was still attached to Antarctica, and India was speeding northward on its way to crash into Asia. The planet was in motion, not rushing, but endlessly rearranging itself. The climate was warm, almost tropical across much of the globe. There were no polar ice caps, only vast forests stretching toward the poles, and shallow seas that sparkled under a thick, humid sky. It was a greenhouse world. Carbon dioxide levels were high, sea levels even higher, and yet life flourished in extraordinary abundance. Plants grew thick and fast, feeding herbivores that in turn fed the predators that roamed the plains and forests. This was an Earth at its biological peak, rich, complex, alive with colour and sound. In this world, you might have seen herds of triceratops moving like armoured tanks through fern fields, their frilled heads swaying as they grazed. You might have glimpsed a T-Rex standing motionless for a moment, before lunging forward with terrifying speed, the culmination of over 100 million years of evolution in muscle and bone. Further south, long-necked titanosaurs, some stretching over 30 meters, moved with slow grace across floodplains. Their necks arched like living bridges, their tails sweeping behind them in arcs of dust and sunlight. And yet, it wasn't all giants. The Cretaceous belonged to the small and the nimble too. Mammals no larger than rabbits scurried in the shadows, laying the groundwork for what would one day come after. Birds, newly evolved from their dinosaur ancestors, flitted between branches, already testing the skies that would soon be theirs alone. Even the insects were busy rewriting the rules of life, as flowering plants and pollinators formed one of the most successful partnerships in evolutionary history. The world was noisy in its own ancient way. Cicadas buzzed in forests that had never known human footsteps. The rumble of thunder rolled over coastal plains where storms brewed in the heat. Volcanoes far away exhaled occasional columns of ash, dusting everything with a reminder that Earth itself was still restless. But to the creatures of that time, this was normal. It was home. If you could stand quietly beneath a Cretaceous canopy, you might notice how different the light feels. The air, thick with humidity, scatters sunlight in a golden haze. Ferns sway gently in the breeze, and between their fronds you might catch the glint of an eye. A small dinosaur, feathered and alert, watching you from a distance. Its movements are quick, its gaze intelligent. These were not the sluggish reptiles that old movies once imagined. Dinosaurs were active, warm-blooded in many cases, their bodies finely tuned to their environments. Their world had rhythms as steady as any heartbeat. Rain fell in regular cycles, feeding rivers that wound lazily across continents. The oceans breathed with tides and currents that carried nutrients across thousands of miles. On land, ecosystems balanced delicately. Predators and prey, plants and pollinators, forests and floodplains. Life had become a masterpiece of adaptation. It seemed unstoppable. Of course, the earth beneath it all was already whispering of change. The slow drift of continents altered ocean currents and air patterns. Volcanoes released carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere, sometimes warming the planet, sometimes cooling it. Tiny fluctuations that no creature could sense were adding up across the centuries. But for now, in this snapshot of time, everything looked eternal. There's something humbling about imagining this world, a planet both alien and familiar. The same blue oceans, the same gravity, the same sun tracing arcs through the sky. But everything else transformed. It's a reminder that Earth has worn many faces, each lasting only a moment in the scale of geologic time. The Cretaceous just happened to be one of its most magnificent. You might wonder what it felt like to live then, not as a human observer, but as part of that ancient world. The sense of scale would have been overwhelming. Even the smallest creature would have been dwarfed by its surroundings. Trees rose like cathedrals, the air buzzed with life, and the constant motion of creatures made the land seem alive in every direction. There was no silence, only a natural symphony that played without pause. The great predators would have ruled their territories with precision. A Tyrannosaurus might patrol its domain with the confidence of an apex hunter, its massive head swinging side to side as it scanned for movement. Every sound would matter. The crack of a branch, the rustle of foliage, the distant call of another dinosaur. For the herbivores, survival depended on vigilance. Triceratops would form groups not out of social comfort, but safety. Their horns weren't ornaments. They were insurance against the jaws of giants. And still, amid all this drama, there were moments of quiet. A nesting Maiasaura tending her eggs. A dragonfly landing briefly on the surface of a pond. A breeze moving through the cycads. Life in the Cretaceous wasn't all chase and hunt. It was also patience, balance, and the slow unfolding of existence. From space, if you could have looked down on Earth then, you'd see a planet glowing green and blue under swirling clouds. The land masses were smaller, fragmented, the oceans wider. But it would still look alive, more so than ever before. Photosynthesis, that invisible alchemy of sunlight and air, was painting the planet in endless shades of green. The Earth was breathing deeply. There's an odd comfort in realizing that this world existed completely without us. It thrived, changed, and disappeared long before we arrived. The dinosaurs didn't need observers, historians, or storytellers. They lived, and that was enough. Their existence wasn't a prelude to ours. It was its own complete story, one that lasted for millions of years and then ended in a single shattering moment. But that ending isn't here yet, not in this moment. Right now, in the warmth of the late Cretaceous sun, the Earth feels eternal. There's no sign that anything is wrong, no hint of the shadow that's coming. Even the smallest details, the flight of a bird, the growth of a leaf, continue as they always have. That's what makes this period so haunting to imagine. We know what's coming, they didn't. For now, the dinosaurs rule unchallenged. They've weathered millions of years of evolution, adapted to new climates, new foods, new landscapes. They've seen continents drift, volcanoes rise, seas expand and recede. They've outlasted countless species before them. Why should anything change? It's tempting to think of the Cretaceous as a time of peace before disaster, but that's not quite right. The world was already full of tension and adaptation. Evolution never rests. Every creature was locked in its quiet struggle for survival, every ecosystem balancing on invisible edges. But still, the scale of what was about to happen was beyond anything life had ever faced. The last age of giants was also an age of transition, a final crescendo before silence. Soon, everything that had become so familiar in this world would vanish, replaced by something new. But that's still ahead of us. Right now, the forests are green, the ocean's full, and the air warm. The stage is set. And so we stand for just a moment at the height of the Cretaceous. The earth turning slowly beneath a sky filled with wings. The seas alive with creatures that glide through ancient currents. The land rumbling with the footsteps of giants. A world unaware that it is about to end. The Cretaceous world, for all its scale and power, was also astonishingly delicate. Life didn't just survive, it performed, improvising across every possible landscape the planet could offer. Forests spread like green oceans, rivers braided through lowlands, and the air shimmered with the sound of wings and calls that have been gone for millions of years. The Earth was busy then, every niche occupied, every rhythm accounted for. To live in that time was to be part of a constant choreography of bloom and battle, growth and hunger, where every creature, from the smallest insect to the largest predator, carried the story of its ancestors written in bone and instinct. If you could step quietly through a Cretaceous valley, you would see movement everywhere. A small herd of hadrosaurs wades across a flooded plain, their tails slicing the surface of the water like the keels of ships. They move with the confidence of creatures that have learned the seasons, the flood patterns, and the safest routes to feeding grounds. Nearby, a cluster of pterosaurs perches along the limestone cliffs, their leathery wings folded like sails between gusts of wind. They are not the clumsy gliders you might imagine, but skilled navigators, able to ride thermals with precision. Above them, smaller feathered creatures flit between branches, their calls rising and falling like distant laughter. The Cretaceous earth was lush, and its abundance was owed to a quiet revolution happening among the plants. Flowering plants, angiosperms, had only recently arrived on the evolutionary stage, but their success was immediate and unstoppable. Before them, the land had been ruled by cycads, ferns and conifers, sturdy but simple in their reproduction. The emergence of flowers changed everything. Pollen and nectar invited insects to become collaborators, carrying the genetic material of one plant to another with an efficiency evolution had never seen before. In exchange, the insects gained nourishment. It was the beginning of a partnership that would reshape ecosystems and echo all the way to the present day. Imagine a humid afternoon, somewhere in what is now Mongolia. The sun presses down through the haze, and the ground trembles faintly with the movement of distant herds. At your feet, small flowering plants push through the soil, their blooms simple but vibrant, yellows, whites and purples against the green. Bees as we know them don't exist yet, but early pollinators, beetles, wasps and tiny flies, hover and land, busy in their endless, efficient work. It is here, in these quiet, ordinary exchanges, that the great transformation of the planet is taking place. The dinosaurs, of course, are the headline act of this world. Their bodies dominate the landscape, but their survival depends entirely on the smaller players, the plants, the insects, the climate. Triceratops and Ankylosaurus graze on the low vegetation that flourishes under the new flowering trees. Hadrosaurs strip leaves with beak-like mouths designed for grinding. Even the predators depend on these systems indirectly. Their prey sustained by the relentless work of roots and sunlight. Every roar, every chase, every nest, all of it, ultimately powered by photosynthesis and pollination. The battles of this world were not only physical but ecological. Competition was constant. New species arose, pushing others aside. Climate zones shifted as continents drifted, creating fresh opportunities for some and crises for others. In North America, the Western Interior Seaway split the land into two vast regions, each with its own evolving cast of species. In the north, forests grew dense and temperate. In the south, they thinned into warm plains. Across these divided lands, evolution raced to fill every opening. Horns, frills, armour and speed all became tools of survival, each generation adjusting slightly to the pressures of its environment. The plant life shaped much of this competition. The spread of flowering plants meant new foods, but also new strategies for reaching sunlight. Trees grew taller, leaves thinner, and roots deeper. Insects adapted to the variety of blooms, their bodies changing to carry pollen more efficiently. Some evolved longer tongues, others specialized jaws, each adaptation linking one life to another in a web of dependency. The Earth was no longer just a stage for survival. It had become a living network of partnerships and rivalries. In the oceans, the story was no less dramatic. Warm, shallow seas covered much of the continents, filled with corals, ammonites, and marine reptiles. Giant mosasaurs hunted in these waters, sleek and muscular, apex predators of their realm. Their jaws could crush bone with a single bite, yet they shared the seas with delicate creatures, plankton, algae, and tiny shell builders that together sustained the entire food chain. When one population flourished or faltered, the effects rippled outward like waves after a storm. To picture this world properly, it helps to think of scale. The Cretaceous wasn't simply a collection of giant animals, it was a planet operating on every level of life. Microbes in the soil fixed nitrogen for plants, insects pollinated and decomposed, amphibians filled the margins between land and water. Mammals, though still small, were beginning to diversify in secret, waiting for their chance. The air itself carried the breath of millions of species. It was thick with the scent of growth, decay, and renewal. A living atmosphere. Predation shaped everything. Every species was both hunter and hunted, and the balance between them was delicate. Tyrannosaurus rex was not simply a monster. It was an integral part of the ecosystem, keeping populations in check, removing the weak, and allowing plants to regenerate. The same pattern played out in every habitat. In the forests of what is now South America, the giant herbivorous titanosaurs grazed under the watchful eyes of predatory abelisaurs. In the swamps of Asia, smaller raptors stalked their prey with intelligence and cooperation. Violence and growth existed side by side, necessary halves of a single process. But for all its grandeur, this was a fragile balance. The Cretaceous world operated under conditions that could not last forever. Volcanoes occasionally darkened the skies, reminding everything that the planet itself was alive and volatile. Climate shifts, though gradual, could alter entire ecosystems. Yet, somehow, life adapted again and again. When a forest burned, new plants grew. When sea levels rose, new coastlines became nurseries for life. The world was always adjusting, always learning how to continue. If you could walk through one of those ancient forests, you might notice how strangely familiar it feels. The buzzing of insects, the rustle of leaves, the calls of unseen birds, they are sounds that never truly vanished. Even the air, warm and heavy, would carry a sense of continuity, as if the planet were whispering through time. The dinosaurs may be gone, but their world shaped the one we live in now. Every tree outside your window, every blade of grass, every bird's call traces its lineage back to this era of bloom and battle. Some of the creatures of this time were as remarkable for their ingenuity as for their size. The small raptor-like dinosaurs, for instance, displayed signs of complex behaviour, pack hunting, nesting care, perhaps even communication beyond simple calls. Fossils show evidence of brooding, of parents guarding eggs, of group living. Life was not mindless instinct. It was organised, adaptive, and surprisingly tender. Evolution was not just shaping bone and muscle, but behaviour and intelligence. And the skies above were changing too. Feathers, which had begun as insulation or display, had become wings capable of sustained flight. The earliest birds were already gliding and flapping with skill, filling niches that would later belong entirely to their descendants. Some still had teeth, others had long tails, but they were unmistakably on their way toward the familiar forms we know today. Every time one took off from a branch, it was a glimpse of the future, a world where dinosaurs would not be gone, only transformed. In the seas, coral reefs expanded across tropical shelves, building enormous underwater cities of life. Fish evolved in dazzling variety. Turtles grew large and slow, drifting through lagoons like living islands. The mosasaurs and plesiosaurs ruled as apex predators, but even they lived by the same rule as everything else: adapt or vanish. The competition never stopped, even in the quiet depths. It's easy to think of this age as peaceful, but that's an illusion born of distance. The Cretaceous was a constant struggle. Droughts, floods, storms and predators made every day a gamble. Survival meant endurance. But through it all, the planet continued to create new species, new behaviours, new forms of beauty. Evolution never slept, even when the world seemed calm. The ecosystems of the Cretaceous were as complex as any modern rainforest. Energy flowed in intricate loops from sunlight to leaf, from leaf to herbivore, from herbivore to predator, and back to the soil. Every death fed new life. Fossilized bones found in floodplains and riverbeds tell this story clearly. The remains of one animal became nourishment for another, directly or through decay. Nothing was wasted. Even in extinction, life was feeding itself. One of the quiet marvels of this era was how evenly distributed life had become. Warm temperatures and high sea levels allowed plants and animals to thrive even near the poles. Fossil forests found in what is now Alaska and Antarctica show that these regions, though dark for part of the year, were covered in greenery. Dinosaurs lived there too. Smaller species adapted to cooler conditions, their metabolisms keeping them active through long winters. The adaptability of life was astonishing, as if Earth itself refused to draw boundaries. You might think of the Cretaceous as Earth's grand experiment in abundance. It tested every possible shape, colour and behaviour. Some creatures grew armour, others relied on camouflage. Some ran on 2 legs, others on 4. Some flew, some swam, some burrowed underground. Every form was an answer to a question the environment was asking, and for a time those answers worked perfectly. But in the middle of all this success, there were hints of fragility. Some species began to disappear even before the final catastrophe. Changes in sea levels and volcanic activity caused local extinctions. Food sources shifted. The interconnected web of life, so intricate and beautiful, was always on the edge of imbalance. One small disruption could echo through entire ecosystems. When we imagine this world, it's tempting to see it as distant and unrelated to ours. But in truth, we are living in its aftermath. The flowers outside your window, the bees hovering nearby, the birds that fill the morning air, they all descend from this age. The systems built in the Cretaceous didn't vanish with the dinosaurs. They evolved, adapted, and continued. We are, in a very literal way, walking through the continuation of that ancient story. The world of bloom and battle was not a pause before destruction. It was a triumph in its own right. A world at the height of complexity, the culmination of billions of years of experimentation. Every creature that lived then was the result of unbroken survival, stretching back to the dawn of life. Every leaf, every egg, every footprint in the mud was part of that vast, ongoing experiment called evolution. And though we know now how it ends, the fire, the dust, the silence, it's worth remembering that, for them, the future was still unwritten. The herd still grazed, the predators still hunted, the forest still bloomed, the insects still danced among the flowers, unaware that they were part of something enduring. If you close your eyes and picture it, you might almost hear it. The steady breathing of a planet alive in every corner, the faint tremor of footsteps too large to imagine, the hum of wings, the whisper of leaves. Life, at its most complete, unaware that it was nearing the edge of change. The Earth had created its masterpiece, and even though it didn't know it, the curtain was already beginning to rise on a new act. The air would soon darken, the balance would soon break. But not yet. For now, the world was in bloom, and the battle for life continued quietly beneath a sun that had no reason to suspect it was witnessing the end of an age. The seas of the Cretaceous were vast, warm and restless. They spread across the continents in wide, shallow expanses that blurred the line between land and ocean. To stand on the shore of one of these inland seas would have been to look upon a landscape in constant motion, where the horizon shimmered with humidity and the air carried the mingled scents of salt, vegetation and distant storms. These waters were the silent architects of the age, shaping coastlines, feeding ecosystems, and nurturing some of the most extraordinary life forms the planet would ever know. The Cretaceous was an oceanic world in every sense. Much of North America lay beneath a broad sea that cut the continent in two from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. This western interior seaway was not a static body of water. It shifted with the seasons and the slow breathing of the planet, expanding and retreating over millions of years. To its west lay rising mountain ranges, to its east broad lowlands lined with forests and marshes. Rivers poured into it, carrying sediments that settled in quiet layers, capturing fossils and traces of the creatures that once swam there. If you could have floated upon those waters, you would have seen an ecosystem as rich as any coral reef today. Beneath the surface moved schools of fish in dazzling patterns, their scales catching the sunlight that filtered down in soft green-gold beams. Ammonites, spiral-shelled relatives of modern squid, drifted gracefully, their tentacles exploring the currents. They were ancient travellers, having survived multiple mass extinctions already, and they carried with them the geometry of time itself, each coil a record of growth and endurance. Deeper still, in the open waters, swam the true giants of the Cretaceous seas. Mosasaurs, the undisputed rulers of the marine world, glided through the depths with serpentine grace. They were reptiles, not fish, descended from land-dwelling ancestors who had returned to the water generations before. Their bodies were built for speed, driven by powerful tails that sliced through the currents like blades. Their jaws, lined with conical teeth, could seize and crush anything that crossed their path. Fish, turtles, even smaller mosasaurs. Some stretched over 15 meters, long enough to rival a modern whale. These predators moved with precision. They did not chase blindly. They waited, turned, and struck with calculated force. Each motion conserved energy in a world where food, though abundant, was never guaranteed. Fossil evidence shows that some species of mosasaurs gave birth to live young, suggesting that they lived their entire lives in the sea. No nesting grounds on land, no clumsy crawls across beaches. They were creatures of the deep in every sense. Among them swam plesiosaurs, their long necks moving like eels through the water, their paddle-like limbs beating rhythmically. Some species had necks so extended they seemed impossible, each vertebra part of an elegant and improbable design. Their heads were small, but their reach was long, perfect for darting into schools of fish or snatching prey that drifted too close. They were slower than the mosasaurs, but no less efficient, gliding silently through the water as if time itself moved at their pace. Above them, in the open air, pterosaurs circled, scanning for movement beneath the waves. Some species, like Pteranodon, had wingspans over 7 meters and could travel vast distances across the seaway, diving occasionally to snatch fish near the surface. Their cries would echo across the water, mingling with the hiss of waves against the shore. From a distance, they might have looked like seabirds, but their flight was heavier, their movements slower, almost deliberate. The Cretaceous oceans were not merely hunting grounds, they were nurseries of evolution. New species of fish appeared, their bodies adapting to every possible niche: shallow swimmers, bottom feeders, fast predators built for bursts of speed. The first recognizable ancestors of modern sharks thrived here too, their sleek forms already perfect for the endless chase. Rays glided along the seabed, stirring clouds of sand in search of shellfish. Crustaceans scuttled among coral and seaweed, their claws and armour as intricate as any mechanical invention. And at the base of it all, invisible to the eye, was the quiet miracle of plankton, tiny drifting organisms that captured sunlight and transformed it into energy, feeding everything above them in the chain. Their presence filled the water with life, every breath taken by every creature in the Cretaceous seas, every heartbeat, every motion of fin or tail, began with these microscopic architects of abundance. It is humbling to realize that the mightiest mosasaur owed its existence to the quiet labor of unseen plankton drifting on the current. In the shallows, where sunlight touched the seafloor, coral reefs spread like living cities. They provided shelter for countless small species, fish, mollusks and invertebrates that darted in and out of the labyrinthine coral walls. The reefs thrived in the warmth of the Cretaceous seas, growing taller, brighter, more complex with each passing generation. Life in these reefs operated in perfect cycles: birth, growth, decay, renewal, all repeating endlessly beneath the waves. The oceans were also archives. Every year, sediments fell gently to the bottom, layering over the last. Dead organisms sank, their remains trapped in the mud, forming the fossil record that would one day tell this story. The shells of ammonites, the teeth of mosasaurs, the scales of fish, all slowly turned to stone. Time worked patiently in these depths, writing the history of the world grain by grain. Not everything in these waters was peaceful. Competition was constant, and the ocean's abundance came at a cost. For every successful predator, hundreds of smaller creatures struggled to survive. Fossilized shells show bite marks, scars, and signs of healing. A record of lives lived on the edge. Some ammonites developed thicker shells. Others changed their shape, evolving spines or patterns that helped them blend into the background. Adaptation was the rule, and the pressure never ceased. Storms were frequent and violent. The Cretaceous climate, while generally warm, was not without extremes. Seasonal changes brought tempests that could churn the shallow seas into chaos. Waves rose like walls, tearing at coastlines and scattering debris across miles. In those moments, the delicate balance of life could be undone in an instant. Yet even after the storms passed, the sea would calm, and the cycle would begin again. That rhythm, destruction and renewal was the ocean's heartbeat. If you could descend into the darker layers of the water, where sunlight no longer reached, the world would change completely. Down there, the colours fade, replaced by the quiet glow of bioluminescence. Strange, soft lights drift through the black, organisms that make their own illumination. Jellyfish-like creatures pulse gently, their bodies almost transparent. Predators lurk in the dark, their eyes adapted to the faintest shimmer of motion. In this world of shadows and silence, survival takes on a different form. The pace slows, the movements are cautious, the energy scarce. Yet even here, life thrives. These depths remind us that the ocean has always been a world apart, self-contained, mysterious, and largely beyond the reach of land. While the dinosaurs ruled the surface, these unseen realms followed their own ancient logic, unchanged and undisturbed. The creatures that lived there would endure the coming extinction far better than their terrestrial counterparts. When the skies darkened and the land grew cold, the deep ocean would remain a refuge, insulated by its vastness. The chemistry of the Cretaceous seas was also changing, though the animals living there could not have known it. Volcanic activity on land released carbon dioxide that was slowly absorbed into the water, altering its acidity. Subtle shifts in temperature and salinity created layers within the ocean that determined where different species could live. Some regions grew rich in oxygen, others poor. Life adapted accordingly, redistributing itself with each fluctuation. To the creatures within it, the sea must have seemed eternal, but it was already beginning to change in ways that would matter profoundly later. The coastal margins were especially dynamic. Mangrove-like forests and swamps lined the edges of the seaway, serving as nurseries for young marine life. Here, the distinction between land and water was blurred. Dinosaurs waded into tidal flats to feed, while fish and amphibians ventured inland with the tides. Fossil tracks found in these regions reveal that even large dinosaurs sometimes crossed through shallow waters, their footprints mingling with those of turtles and crocodiles. These interactions between land and sea formed some of the most productive ecosystems of the age. In those estuaries, you might have seen a group of small bird-like dinosaurs stalking along the shore, their feet sinking into the wet sand. They snap at fish trapped by the retreating tide, their feathers slicked dark with water. Overhead, the air shimmers with heat, and the horizon wavers. The sound of distant waves blends with the cries of pterosaurs, the splash of a diving predator, the hiss of the breeze moving through reeds. It is a moment that feels alive in every direction, the kind of stillness that only exists when everything is moving. Every creature in this world lived within limits defined by the sea. Even the dinosaurs far inland depended on it indirectly. The oceans controlled the climate, the rainfall, the temperature of the air. They were the engine of Earth's stability. Every drop of water evaporated into the sky, fell as rain, and returned again, carrying nutrients and minerals that sustained life on land. The ocean was not separate from the world above. It was its beating heart. The fossils found today in ancient seabeds tell us that this balance persisted for millions of years. The same layers that hold the remains of ammonites and mosasaurs also preserve pollen from flowering plants, ash from distant volcanoes, and traces of meteorite dust. The ocean collected everything, holding it quietly until we were ready to read it. It is a vast library of time, written not in words but in calcium and carbon. When you imagine this world, it's easy to focus on the great beasts, the predators, the size, the spectacle. But the deeper truth of the Cretaceous ocean lies in its subtlety. It was a system of relationships, of endless interactions between the smallest and the largest forms of life. It was an ecosystem built on cooperation as much as competition. Even the fiercest predator depended on the unseen labour of algae and plankton, of currents and chemistry. The sea held everything together. There's something almost meditative about picturing that endless expanse. The light filtering down through the water, the slow undulation of movement, the rise and fall of the tides. For all its ferocity, the ocean was a place of rhythm. The waves carried energy across thousands of miles, touching shores that no creature had yet named. The pulse of that energy has never stopped. When you stand at the edge of the sea today and listen to the surf, you're hearing the same rhythm that shaped the Cretaceous world. The same waves, the same gravity, the same ancient heartbeat. In those waters, evolution was quietly preparing for what came next. New groups of fish were beginning to take forms that would one day fill modern oceans. Early relatives of seabirds were testing the boundaries between air and water. Some marine reptiles were shrinking in size, specializing for survival in tighter niches. The ocean was already writing its next chapter, one that would unfold after the Great Extinction. But for now, it was alive in full. If you were to dive there, the experience would be overwhelming. The colours, The sound of your own heartbeat mixing with the faint roar of distant currents, the flash of movement at the edge of vision. Every sense would be filled with life. It would feel eternal, as though nothing could disturb it. That illusion of permanence was one of the ocean's oldest tricks, its calm surface hiding a world of constant change beneath. In time, the balance would shift. The Earth's climate would falter. The tides would draw back. The rich marine world that had flourished for so long would begin to thin. But in the span of the Cretaceous, that moment was still far away. For now the sea was everything. A cradle, a battlefield, a mirror. Its light touched every part of life, even the land it could not reach. The oceans of the Cretaceous were the planet's memory and its promise, a world of shadows and light that shaped everything to come. Above the shimmering seas of the Cretaceous, another world unfolded. It was lighter, thinner, and filled with motion. The air itself was alive with wings. From tiny darting creatures that flitted between leaves to vast gliders that could cross entire coastlines without a single flap, the sky had become its own wilderness. The age of dinosaurs was not just about the ground and sea. It was also the moment when life truly conquered the air. The skies of that time would have looked nothing like the ones we know. The light was softer, scattered through the haze of humidity that wrapped much of the planet. Clouds formed thick and high, glowing with reflected sunlight that bounced from the oceans below. Across this endless dome of air moved creatures that were part dinosaur, part something new. The Cretaceous sky was not empty space. It was a living habitat, layered like the forests and oceans beneath it, filled with predators, scavengers, travellers, and explorers of the wind. Among the first to claim these heights were the pterosaurs, masters of flight long before any bird spread its wings. They had ruled the air for millions of years, adapting into dozens of forms, from small, agile hunters that darted over rivers to enormous species whose wings stretched wider than any creature before or since. Their bodies were built for flight. Hollow bones, powerful muscles, and wings formed from a thin membrane of skin that stretched from their elongated fourth finger to their sides. Theirs was a different kind of flight than birds. It was gliding, soaring, efficient, and ancient. Imagine a coastline at dawn. The mist rises slowly over the water, and from the cliffs a group of pteranodons launches into the wind. Their wings catch the rising air currents, and they glide effortlessly, barely moving. Below them, the ocean ripples with the movement of fish near the surface. Every tilt of a wing, every subtle shift in angle, allows them to stay aloft with almost no effort. They dip their long beaks toward the water, snatching prey in a quick, precise motion. A few call out to each other, their voices echoing across the waves, low and resonant. It is a routine repeated thousands of times a day, as natural to them as breathing. On the cliffs, younger individuals watch and wait. They stretch their wings, testing the breeze. Their first flights will be dangerous. A misjudged gust, a stumble, and the fall could be fatal. But instinct drives them to try. When one finally leaps, it's not graceful. A tumble, a frantic beat of wings, then suddenly lift. The air catches, and the creature steadies. For the first time, it feels the invisible strength of the wind beneath it. Flight isn't just movement. It's a negotiation with physics, a balance between gravity and lift. The pterosaurs had mastered that conversation better than any creature before them. As time passed, their variety grew. Some species evolved long crests on their heads, possibly for display or stability. Others shrank into nimble insect eaters, darting through forests. But the skies were beginning to change because something new had entered them. Descendants of small, feathered dinosaurs who had taken a different evolutionary path. The first true birds. The ancestors of birds had been experimenting with flight for millions of years. Fossils like Archaeopteryx from earlier in the Jurassic show that feathers first appeared not for flying, but for warmth or display. Over time, those feathers became longer, more specialised until they began to catch the air. The line between gliding and true flight blurred. In the Cretaceous, that experiment had reached its peak. The skies now belonged to two very different kinds of flyers, the leathery winged pterosaurs and the feathered birds that would eventually replace them. It's remarkable to think that these birds were dinosaurs in every biological sense. They shared the same skeletal structures, the same patterns of muscle attachment and even similar nesting behaviours. But evolution had given them something extraordinary, feathers capable of generating lift through flapping, not just gliding. This meant agility. Where pterosaurs soared long distances, birds could twist, turn and hover. They could dart between trees and escape predators with manoeuvres that the larger flyers could never match. In a Cretaceous forest, you might have seen small bird-like creatures flitting through the undergrowth. Some still had teeth in their beaks, others had claws on their wings, many had long feathered tails that helped them steer. Their feathers were iridescent, shimmering with greens, blues and copper hues, just like modern birds. Each movement was a precise calculation of balance, wings adjusting subtly with each gust of air. They weren't just surviving, they were exploring a new dimension of existence. The evolution of flight reshaped ecosystems in ways no single development had before. Flight allowed creatures to reach new habitats, escape ground-based predators, and find food in places that had once been inaccessible. Insects, which had already spread widely thanks to the flowering plants, now faced a new kind of predator. Birds fed on them in vast numbers, keeping populations in check while also spreading seeds and pollen between plants. Flight connected the sky to the ground in an endless exchange of energy and life. Over lakes and rivers, early water birds hunted for fish, their beaks long and pointed. In the forests, smaller species fed on insects or seeds, nesting in the branches of the new flowering trees. Each species found its place in the layered airspace above the earth. Some stayed close to the ground, darting between ferns and bushes. Others soared high, riding thermals above the treetops. The Cretaceous sky was busy, crowded, alive with calls, wings and movement. The relationship between birds and the land below them was intimate. When volcanoes erupted or wildfires spread, many birds could flee, carrying the memory of the land with them, seeds in their stomachs, spores on their feathers. When the world changed, they carried the possibility of renewal across great distances. Even in an age defined by giants, it was the lightest creatures that would prove the most enduring. One of the most fascinating details about these early birds is how quickly they diversified. Fossil evidence shows an explosion of species during the late Cretaceous, each adapted to a specific niche. Some were strong flyers, built for migration. Others barely flew at all, relying on running or gliding. The adaptability of birds made them resilient to environmental change, a quality that would later ensure their survival when most of their relatives vanished. Not all that flew had feathers. The pterosaurs, though ancient, continued to thrive in parallel. In some regions they grew even larger. Quetzalcoatlus, one of the last and greatest of them, could reach heights comparable to a giraffe when standing on the ground. Its wingspan stretched over 10 meters, yet despite its size it could fly, not through brute strength, but through mastery of air currents. It likely used a technique called dynamic soaring, catching the wind rising from cliffs and ridges to stay aloft for hours with minimal effort. Seeing such a creature glide overhead must have been awe-inspiring. Its shadow alone could darken a small clearing. The coexistence of pterosaurs and birds is one of evolution's more elegant stories. They shared the same air but rarely the same roles. Pterosaurs ruled the open skies and coasts, while birds increasingly dominated forests and smaller habitats. Rather than direct competition, they seemed to partition the atmosphere, each group carving out its own kingdom in the wind. The balance worked beautifully until the end. It's easy to overlook how profoundly flight affected life on Earth. With wings, creatures could follow the seasons, migrate to avoid famine or cold, and spread life farther than ever before. The atmosphere became a corridor of movement, linking continents. Pollination, seed dispersal, and even nutrient cycles began to depend on wings. The Earth, once a patchwork of isolated environments, was becoming connected through air travel long before humans ever dreamed of it. The bones of flying creatures tell us much about their lives. Pterosaur fossils show adaptations for strength and weight reduction, bones hollowed but reinforced with fine struts, capable of supporting enormous wings without breaking. Bird fossils, on the other hand, reveal innovations in breathing. Air sacs extended from their lungs into their bones, allowing continuous oxygen flow even during strenuous flight. These systems were so efficient that they would later enable birds to survive conditions that killed most other species. Evolution, through countless trials, had built perfection in motion. Insects, too, filled the skies in abundance, and the relationship between them and the flying vertebrates became a quiet arms race. As birds improved their hunting techniques, insects evolved better camouflage, faster flight, and, in some cases, defensive chemicals that made them less appealing as prey. This interplay of adaptation drove both sides forward, weaving an invisible thread of cause and effect through the Cretaceous sky. Above the inland seas, storms brewed with intensity. Air masses moved differently in a greenhouse world. The absence of polar ice meant global circulation patterns were slower, and tropical storms could stretch across entire regions. For creatures that lived on the wind, these storms were both danger and opportunity. Strong thermals could carry them for hundreds of kilometres, but a sudden shift could also dash them to the ground. Fossils of pterosaurs have been found far inland, perhaps carried by storms they could not escape. Flight was freedom, but it demanded constant awareness. At night the skies would have transformed, the air cooled, insects swarmed, a nocturnal species took over. Some small birds and flying reptiles may have hunted under the light of the moon, using sight adapted to low light. The stars above would have looked familiar, the same constellations, the same sweep of the Milky Way, but viewed from a planet that was warmer, greener, and louder than ours. Even then, the rhythms of day and night governed life as they do now, setting the pace for feeding, resting, and migration. If you picture that ancient sky long enough, it becomes easy to forget how strange it truly was. The silhouettes that moved across it were neither the birds we know nor the creatures we could easily imagine. Some had tails like ribbons, others had wings edged with claws. Many species were transitional, caught in the act of becoming something new. Evolution is rarely tidy. It's full of half-finished experiments that work just long enough to persist. The Cretaceous skies were full of them, fleeting solutions to the problem of flight. The nests of these creatures tell another part of the story. Fossilized nests show patterns of care, protection, and planning. Eggs were arranged carefully, sometimes in communal clusters, suggesting cooperation. Feathers found in these sites indicate that brooding was already common among both bird-like dinosaurs and early birds. The warmth of a parent's body was enough to keep the next generation alive. Flight may have taken life into the air, but it also deepened the connections on the ground. And there was beauty in these creatures, not in a romantic or symbolic way, but in the quiet logic of adaptation. The colours of their feathers, the shapes of their crests, the arcs of their wings, all of it reflected purpose. Every line and contour was the product of function refined by time. Watching them would not have felt like watching chaos. It would have felt like witnessing the rules of physics expressed as life. Even the soundscape would have been distinctive. The air would carry layers of noise, the rush of wings, the cries of pterosaurs, the chirps and whistles of early birds, the distant rumble of thunder. To live in that world was to be surrounded by sound. It was a planet learning to sing through the air. The skies of the Cretaceous remind us that Earth's history has always been a story of expansion, from water to land, from land to air, from instinct to intelligence. Each step opened new worlds, and each world brought its own risks. Flight was one of the greatest of these leaps, and though it seems effortless when we watch a bird today, it was earned through countless generations of trial and error. The creatures that filled the Cretaceous air were the culmination of that long experiment. And as the world beneath them continued to change, forests growing thicker, volcanoes reshaping continents, oceans shifting, the flyers adapted in turn. They followed the climate, tracked the seasons, and found stability in motion. They had no sense that their age was nearing its close, no awareness of the fragility of their existence. To them, the world was infinite. The air was theirs. High above the plains, a Quetzalcoatlus catches a rising current and begins to climb. Its massive wings tilt slightly, catching the sun. Below, herds move across the land, rivers wind through forests, and the sea glimmers in the distance. The creature soars higher, weightless, unhurried. It circles once, twice, then glides forward, vanishing into the haze of the horizon. The sky remains behind it, vast, timeless, filled with the echoes of life in flight. The land beneath the Cretaceous skies was restless. It was not a silent foundation, but a living surface, moving, breaking, and rebuilding itself over millions of years. To the creatures walking across it, the ground may have seemed eternal, solid, dependable, but it was in constant motion. Beneath the soil, beneath the roots, the earth was shifting. It was stretching apart and colliding in slow, invisible movements that shaped every valley, every coastline, and every horizon. The world of the Cretaceous was divided into continents that looked roughly familiar, yet deeply strange. North America, South America, Africa, Eurasia, and Antarctica had already begun to resemble the map we know today, but their positions were still unsettled. They were drifting, pulled and pushed by the currents of molten rock below. The Atlantic Ocean was young, still widening. India was a separate island continent, racing northward at an almost reckless pace, bound for its future collision with Asia. The edges of continents were fringed by volcanoes and mountains that rose slowly, their growth measured not in lifetimes, but in ages. If you could stand in one place for 10 million years and watch, you would see continents move like slow clouds, oceans expand, and mountain ranges crumble into dust. The earth was alive, and its movement set the stage for everything above it. The air, the oceans, the climate, all of them followed the rhythm of the shifting ground. To the dinosaurs that walked those lands, none of this was visible. What they knew were the forests, the plains, the rivers that carved through soft stone, and the distant rumble of volcanoes. The soil they stepped on was thick with decay and growth, a mixture of fallen leaves, weathered rock, and the remains of countless plants and animals that had lived and died before them. Each footprint they left pressed into a surface made from deep time. The continents were more humid than today. Rainfall was heavy, especially near the equator. Rivers swelled with the monsoons, overflowing their banks and creating fertile floodplains where herds of herbivores gathered to feed. These lowlands were rich with vegetation, cycads, ferns, palms, and flowering plants forming dense jungles that stretched for miles. The air carried the scent of resin and wet earth. Every step stirred the smell of life and decomposition. Farther inland, the terrain changed. Volcanic fields and mountain chains divided ecosystems. In what is now western North America, the early rise of the Rocky Mountains was underway. The movement of tectonic plates forced land upward, folding layers of rock into ridges that would one day dominate the continent. In the shadows of these growing mountains, new rivers were born, carrying minerals and nutrients toward the inland seas. Life followed these waterways, adapting to new climates, new altitudes, and new challenges. The connection between geology and biology was constant. When volcanoes erupted, ash fell across the landscape, burying forests and plains. At first it was destruction. The air darkened, the plants withered, the rivers filled with debris. But after the ash settled and mixed with the soil, it brought nutrients that renewed the land. Within a few years, new growth would cover the scars richer than before. The Earth's violence was part of its fertility. Even in the calmest regions, the planet's surface never stopped changing. In coastal areas, sediment built up layer by layer, forming cliffs and plateaus that would one day record the history of the Cretaceous like pages in stone. Each flood, each landslide, each volcanic deposit became a chapter. When we find fossils today, the bones of dinosaurs, the impressions of leaves, the shells of ancient creatures, we are reading those pages. They are the physical memories of the Earth itself. The soil of that world was alive in its own quiet way. Microbes and fungi decomposed organic matter, releasing nutrients back into the cycle. The roots of plants anchored themselves deep into the earth, binding layers of sediment and creating networks that stabilized ecosystems. Burrowing animals, small mammals, reptiles, and insects worked the ground constantly, mixing air and organic matter through the soil. It was a system of endless renewal. Every death fed new life. Every fallen tree became the foundation for another. If you walked through one of those forests, you would feel the ground giving slightly underfoot, soft and warm from decay. The sound of insects would be constant, a background hum that never stopped. Occasionally you might feel a tremor, the distant echo of tectonic movement. To the animals, it meant nothing. They would pause, glance around, and return to feeding or resting. The earth moved beneath them, but it was part of the rhythm of existence. In certain regions, the land carried more dramatic reminders of its volatility. Lava fields stretched across parts of modern-day India and Africa. These eruptions could last for thousands of years, releasing vast amounts of gas and ash into the atmosphere. The Deccan Traps, which formed near the end of the Cretaceous, were among the largest volcanic systems in Earth's history. Layer upon layer of basalt spread outward, creating plateaus that still exist today. Each eruption altered the climate slightly, releasing carbon dioxide that warmed the planet even further. The dinosaurs living nearby would have seen glowing rivers of molten rock flowing slowly across the land, forests igniting, skies darkening, and then, as centuries passed, new soil forming atop the cooled stone. But between these episodes of chaos, the land was stable and abundant. Grass had not yet evolved, so the open spaces were covered in ferns and low plants. Trees rose tall, conifers, cycads, magnolias, and the first hardwoods. Some forests were so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. In others, open clearings created corridors where herds moved seasonally. Migration was common. Herbivores followed the cycles of rain and growth, and predators followed the herbivores. The land dictated their paths, its rivers and mountains forming invisible boundaries between territories. Each ecosystem depended on the geology that supported it. Where volcanic soil was rich, plants grew thick and fast. In drier regions, evolution favoured species with tougher leaves and deeper roots. Along the coastlines, mangrove-like plants stabilised the edges of the land, creating environments where fresh water and salt water mingled. In these places, life overlapped. Fish ventured inland, and land animals came to feed on marine creatures. Every transition zone was an experiment in adaptation. The rivers of the Cretaceous were wide and winding, carrying silt and nutrients through the continents. They carved valleys and left behind fertile floodplains that changed shape with every flood. When water receded, shallow pools formed, trapping fish and small creatures. Insects gathered there, followed by amphibians, reptiles, and birds. The smell of wet vegetation filled the air. Along the banks, nests and burrows lined the softer soil, evidence of how deeply life had learned to use the land. Fossil tracks found in these ancient riverbeds capture moments frozen in time. The crossing of a herd, the chase of a predator, the struggle of an animal trapped in mud. Each set of footprints is a record of movement, a silent photograph pressed into stone. Through them, we can almost feel the weight of their bodies, the texture of the ground beneath their feet, the heat of the day. The shape of the continents influenced not just where animals lived, but how they evolved. As land masses drifted apart, populations became isolated. Species that had once mingled were now separated by oceans or mountains. Over generations they diverged, adapting to their new environments until they became entirely new forms of life. This process, geographic isolation driving evolution, was one of the quiet forces that shaped the incredible diversity of the late Cretaceous. To the dinosaurs, the earth beneath them was both ally and adversary. It provided food, shelter, and safety, but it could also shift without warning. Landslides buried entire herds. Earthquakes opened fissures in the ground. Droughts turned lush plains into cracked wastelands. Life depended on the stability of forces that were never truly stable. Yet somehow, balance always returned. The land destroyed and rebuilt itself in an endless cycle. In many regions, the Earth's slow motion created opportunities. When mountains rose, rain patterns changed and new habitats appeared. When sea levels fell, broad plains emerged, allowing migration and expansion. The Cretaceous landscape was never still. It grew, sank, fractured, and healed over spans of time that no creature could perceive. The rocks beneath each footprint told a story written over eons. If you think of the Earth not as a backdrop but as a character, the Cretaceous becomes easier to imagine. The land was a restless being, breathing through volcanoes, reshaping itself through erosion, and whispering change through the smallest tremor. Every living thing walked upon a surface that was both ancient and temporary. The dinosaurs ruled the earth, but they ruled at the permission of the ground beneath them. The climate reflected this constant geological activity. Warm air currents rose from volcanic regions and spread moisture across continents. The lack of polar ice allowed global temperatures to remain high, but also meant that sea levels fluctuated often. Periods of expansion and contraction created cycles of connection between habitats. Coastal areas were sometimes submerged, then exposed again centuries later. Creatures adapted to both worlds, developing resilience through instability. In the northern reaches, near what would become Alaska, forests stretched close to the poles. Despite months of darkness each year, the climate remained mild enough for life to persist. There, small dinosaurs adapted to cooler conditions, possibly growing feathers for insulation. Their fossils tell us they endured long winters and brief bright summers. The earth beneath their feet may have been frozen part of the year, but it still supported growth, still gave what it could. Even at the edge of habitability, life found a foothold. As the continents continued to move, the geography of Earth slowly began to resemble our own. The Atlantic widened, the Pacific deepened, and chains of volcanic islands rose from the ocean floor. These shifts created corridors for migration and isolation alike. Dinosaurs that once shared common ancestors evolved into distinct forms across different regions. South America developed its own unique species of titanosaurs and carnivorous abelisaurs. In Asia, swift raptors and ceratopsians diversified. North America saw the rise of the great horned dinosaurs and the dominance of Tyrannosaurus. Each landmass was a separate world with its own version of evolution story. Through it all, the land recorded everything. Volcanic ash captured footprints, sediment buried skeletons, minerals replaced bone, turning fragile remains into fossils that would outlast entire eras. Every earthquake, every eruption, every flood contributed to the preservation of history. The earth itself became the storyteller, its layers the archive of what once walked upon it. When we look at those layers today, it's hard not to feel the quiet continuity that connects then and now. The ground we stand on carries the remnants of worlds long gone. The mountains, the valleys, the soil beneath our feet, all are products of the same restless motion that shaped the Cretaceous. The Earth has never stopped moving. It never will. The dinosaurs living in that world didn't sense the deep time unfolding beneath them. They knew the ground only as what supported their weight, carried their food, and echoed their steps. They lived in the moment, each one unaware that the surface they trusted was the product of ancient collisions and invisible forces. Yet everything about their existence depended on that hidden power. Every footprint they left, every nest they built, every migration they made was guided by the contours of a planet in transition. The mountains determined the weather, the rivers determined the forests, the volcanoes determined the soil. The earth beneath their feet decided everything, even their fate. And while the world above was full of motion, wings in the sky, tides in the sea, herds crossing plains, it was the land below that held the story together. Quietly, patiently, it shaped the stage upon which life performed its brief and brilliant act. Beneath the quiet surface of the Cretaceous Earth, something was always stirring. It wasn't visible to the creatures that lived upon it, not in any immediate sense, but the planet had its own steady rhythm, a hidden pulse that never stopped. It was the heartbeat of tectonic plates shifting, of magma rising and cooling, of continents drifting through time. Every mountain range, every valley, every ocean basin was a note in that slow, ongoing vibration. The Earth, even in its calmest moments, was alive with movement. For most of the animals that walked its surface, this motion went unnoticed. They felt the world through the weight of their own steps, through the smell of soil and vegetation, through the rhythm of seasons that repeated again and again. The ground felt solid. The air felt constant. But underneath, molten rock was circulating in slow convection currents, carrying heat from the planet's core to the crust above. That heat drove everything. The drift of continents, the rise of volcanoes, the shaping of coastlines, the chemistry of the oceans, even the air itself. The hidden pulse of the planet controlled life in ways no living creature could sense. If you were to strip away the forests and rivers and dig deep into the crust of that ancient Earth, you would find a world of fire and pressure. The crust was thinner in some regions, thicker in others, constantly breaking and repairing itself. New ocean floors were forming as molten rock rose at mid-ocean ridges and cooled in contact with water. Elsewhere, older crusts sank back into the depths, melting and beginning the cycle again. It was an endless process, one that had already been going on for billions of years, shaping the planet's surface without pause. This slow movement didn't just sculpt the land, it set the tone for everything that lived above it. As continents drifted apart, they carried species with them, isolating populations and forcing evolution to work independently on each fragment of land. Mountains diverted wind and rain, shaping climates. Volcanoes released gases that warmed the planet, while weathering rock pulled those same gases back out of the atmosphere over time. It was a conversation between rock, air, and life that never truly ended. The Cretaceous world was particularly warm, and much of that heat came from this inner pulse. Volcanic activity was frequent and intense. Beneath the surface, magma chambers expanded and contracted, feeding eruptions that spread ash and lava across vast areas. In places like what is now India, these eruptions continued for thousands of years, layering the land with basalt flows that still exist today. Each eruption released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, adding to the greenhouse effect that kept global temperatures high. At the same time, the oceans absorbed heat and carbon, circulating them through deep currents. The water that sank near the poles, cooler and denser, carried dissolved gases into the deep sea, while warmer water rose near the equator. This constant movement distributed energy across the planet, creating a delicate balance between land, sea, and sky. The Earth's pulse could not be seen, but its effects touched everything. Sometimes the planet's rhythm grew louder, sudden, sharp, violent. Earthquakes tore through fault lines, splitting rock and shifting entire landscapes in seconds. To the dinosaurs, these moments must have seemed like the world itself was waking from a dream. A herd might stop grazing as the ground trembled beneath them, trees shuddering, rivers sloshing against their banks. Then, as quickly as it began, the movement would fade. the Earth would return to its slow breathing, its hidden motion continuing beneath the calm. These geological shifts shaped where life could thrive. When new mountain ranges rose, rainfall patterns changed. Some regions became deserts, others turned into rainforests. When land bridges formed between continents, species migrated and mingled. When those bridges sank again beneath rising seas, populations were cut off and evolved separately. The planet's crust was the ultimate architect of biodiversity, redrawing the map of existence over millions of years. Even the chemistry of the atmosphere was tied to this hidden pulse. Volcanic gases like carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and water vapor escaped from the Earth's interior during eruptions. These gases affected temperature and rainfall, cloud formation, and the acidity of the oceans. Over long spans of time, they determined whether the planet warmed or cooled. During the Cretaceous, greenhouse conditions prevailed, but they were not static. Every eruption, every burst of volcanic gas, every shift in the ocean floor tipped the balance slightly. The world adjusted slowly yet continuously. If we could somehow listen to the Earth during this era, not to its surface sounds but to its deep internal rhythm, it would be like hearing a long, low hum that never stops. A vibration carried through stone and water, constant and ancient. That hum, imperceptible to life on the surface, was the planet's way of staying alive. In the fossil record, traces of this hidden activity remain. Layers of ash tell stories of eruptions that blackened the skies. Bands of magnetic minerals record the movement of continents and the reversal of Earth's magnetic field. Shifts in sediment composition reveal changes in ocean chemistry driven by tectonic motion. The Earth's own archives show that even during its most stable ages, it was never truly still. For the living creatures of the Cretaceous, the signs of this interactivity appeared only in moments. The faint rumble of distant thunder that wasn't thunder at all, the sudden birth of a volcano on the horizon, the way a river would suddenly change course after a tremor. Life adapted to these rhythms not through understanding but through persistence. The plants grew back after eruptions. The animals migrated when water disappeared. Survival meant listening, even if unconsciously, to the pulse of the planet beneath their feet. In coastal areas, where tectonic movement was most visible, the land rose and fell in cycles. Coral reefs that had once been underwater became dry islands. Sediment from eroded mountains created new deltas that teemed with life. Over centuries, entire ecosystems shifted without warning. And yet, balance always returned. The planet's hidden rhythm was destructive and generous at the same time. It's remarkable how much the biosphere and the geosphere were intertwined. The very act of life existing, plants taking in carbon dioxide, animals breathing oxygen, microbes breaking down minerals, influenced the chemistry of the planet. The Earth, in turn, shaped life through its shifting continents and evolving climate. It was not a one-way relationship, but a constant exchange. The pulse of the planet was mirrored in the pulse of life. Deep in the Earth's core, a metallic heart turned slowly, generating the planet's magnetic field. That invisible shield protected the atmosphere from solar wind, allowing the delicate balance of gases to remain intact. Without it, Earth's air and oceans might have been stripped away, as happened on Mars. The same magnetic forces that guided ancient compasses also guided the flow of molten rock, aligning crystals in patterns that scientists can still read today. Every reversal of polarity, every fluctuation became part of the record. The Earth's pulse wasn't uniform. Some regions were calm, stable for millions of years, while others were restless. Along subduction zones, where one tectonic plate slid beneath another, volcanoes rose in chains. Along rift zones, new crust was born. These regions were where change began, where the deep interior of the planet touched the surface and altered it forever. If you could map the world's heartbeat, these would be its arteries and veins, glowing with heat and motion. Even the weather carried the signature of this pulse. When volcanic gases reached the upper atmosphere, they reacted with sunlight and water vapour, sometimes forming aerosols that reflected light and cooled the planet temporarily. Other times they trapped heat, thickening the greenhouse blanket. The cycles of eruption and recovery created long-term fluctuations in global temperature. These shifts were slow enough that ecosystems could often adapt, though not always without cost. For the creatures that lived through them, these changes might have seemed like the work of chance. Seasons growing slightly longer or shorter, rainfall coming a little later each year, forests spreading or retreating. But all of it was connected to the deep processes hidden beneath their feet. The Earth was not just a stage, it was a participant in its own story. If you were to stand on a high plateau during the Cretaceous, you might feel a faint vibration underfoot, though you wouldn't recognise its source. The mountains in the distance would seem unchanging, but they were slowly rising. The rivers below would appear permanent, though they were carving new paths each century. Even the coastline you saw would one day be swallowed by the sea or lifted into the sky. The Earth's pulse was patient, but unstoppable. Over time, these movements began to accumulate in ways that would matter deeply. The volcanic outpourings of regions like the Deccan Traps released enormous volumes of gas that gradually altered the atmosphere. The oceans absorbed much of it, buffering the effect for a while, but small changes in acidity began to ripple through marine ecosystems. Some plankton species declined, altering the food web from the bottom up. These were slow warnings, subtle adjustments that preceded the more dramatic events still to come. Yet despite these shifts, life continued to flourish. Forests grew thick on volcanic soil. New species appeared faster than others disappeared. The planet seemed to be in a state of equilibrium, even as its foundations moved beneath it. That illusion of balance would persist right up to the end of the Cretaceous, when the hidden pulse of the planet would be joined by something far more sudden, an impact from beyond the Earth itself. But for now, in this era, the pulse continued as it always had, deep and steady, shaping the world with every unseen movement. The atmosphere, the seas, the continents, the creatures, all of them were products of this rhythm. Every breath of air, every drop of rain, every grain of sand owed its existence to the flow of energy from within the Earth. The hidden pulse was the planet's oldest constant, a reminder that even in silence, motion never truly stops. And above it all, life carried on, unaware, untroubled, perfectly in tune with the rhythm it could not hear. The world above the restless Earth was green. Not the kind of green we see today, soft and scattered across cultivated landscapes, but a deep, overwhelming green that seemed to breathe with the planet itself. Forests covered nearly every continent, spreading over mountains, valleys and swamps, wrapping the land in an endless web of leaves and stems and roots. The Cretaceous was, in many ways, the age of plants, as much as it was the age of dinosaurs. It was the great flourishing of the green world, a time when photosynthesis reached its peak, and life on land became dense, layered, and intricate beyond anything that had existed before. If you could walk through a Cretaceous forest, your first impression would be of size. Trees towered above, their trunks thick and rough, their crowns vanishing into a canopy so dense that the sunlight filtered down in shifting beams. The air would be heavy with humidity, thick with the scent of sap and decaying leaves. The sounds would come from every direction. The low call of distant animals, the rustle of creatures moving through undergrowth, the constant buzz of insects. Every breath you took would be filled with the sharp green scent of vegetation. It was a world that grew without pause, a landscape that never slept. The plants of that time were both familiar and alien. Conifers still dominated many regions, their needle-like leaves adapted to the warmth and moisture of the Cretaceous climate, but they were beginning to share space with a new arrival, flowering plants. These angiosperms had appeared millions of years earlier, but during this period they spread across the globe, transforming ecosystems from the ground up. Flowers meant seeds, nectar, fruit, and most importantly, pollination. The arrival of flowers changed not just how plants reproduced, but how animals lived. Pollination was one of the quiet revolutions of Earth's history. Before flowers, most plants relied on the wind to carry pollen, an inefficient process that wasted vast amounts of energy. But flowers found a better way. They offered rewards, nectar, scent, and colour, to attract insects and other animals. In exchange, those creatures carried pollen directly from one bloom to another. It was a partnership so effective that it reshaped the biosphere. Bees, butterflies, beetles, and even small reptiles became messengers of reproduction. Each visit, each landing, carried the possibility of new growth. In the Cretaceous, this partnership was still young, still experimental. Early flowers were simpler, less varied than those we know today. Their petals were often small, their colours limited, but even so they were irresistible to the creatures that had begun to evolve alongside them. Fossilised pollen grains show up in rocks across every continent from this era, marking the spread of angiosperms like fingerprints across time. Wherever they grew, ecosystems grew more complex. The presence of flowers also changed the structure of food webs. Plants that produced fruit began to attract animals that would eat it and spread their seeds. Over time, this led to new behaviours, new relationships between species. Herbivores began to browse differently, feeding selectively on flowering plants rather than the tougher leaves of conifers. Insects diversified to match the new resources available. Even the great dinosaurs felt the effects. Some species developed beaks and teeth better suited for clipping leaves and stems. Others adapted their digestive systems to handle new kinds of vegetation. The forests themselves were layered worlds. The canopy was ruled by the trees, conifers, cycads, magnolias, and the first hardwoods. Beneath that layer, smaller trees and shrubs filled the gaps, their leaves reaching for whatever sunlight filtered through. The forest floor was a dense mat of ferns, mosses, and low-lying plants, damp and full of life. Streams and rivers cut through these forests, their banks lined with horsetails and reeds. In the shadows, fungi decomposed fallen wood, returning nutrients to the soil. Everything in the green world was connected, growth feeding decay, decay feeding growth. Amid this living architecture, animals moved constantly. Herds of herbivorous dinosaurs wandered through the trees, their massive bodies parting branches and crushing ferns underfoot. They fed slowly, stripping leaves with mouths adapted to every possible shape of vegetation. Hadrosaurs, with their broad duck-like beaks, ground up soft plants in complex jaws lined with hundreds of teeth. Ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs, used their sharp beaks to bite through tougher stems and roots. Sauropods reached high into the canopy, pulling down entire branches with sweeping motions of their long necks. Every feeding motion reshaped the forest, pruning it, spreading seeds through droppings, and opening sunlight patches where new plants could grow. Smaller creatures thrived in the spaces the giants left behind. Lizards and mammals darted between roots, searching for insects and fallen fruit. Insects themselves filled every corner, crawling, flying, burrowing. Beetles bored into wood. Termites built colonies inside fallen trunks. Ants began to appear, experimenting with social organisation that would one day dominate entire ecosystems. The forest was not a single community, but a collection of countless micro-worlds, each sustained by the constant exchange of energy between sunlight, plant, and animal. In this green world, time moved differently. Growth was steady, almost rhythmic. A fallen tree would slowly decay, covered in moss, then fungi, then new shoots. Forest fires, sparked by lightning or volcanic activity, cleared old growth and made space for new life. The balance between destruction and renewal was constant. To the creatures that lived there, it must have felt eternal, a cycle without beginning or end. The climate helped sustain this abundance. The Cretaceous atmosphere held more carbon dioxide than today's, which meant that photosynthesis was particularly efficient. Plants grew faster, larger, and in greater numbers. The oxygen levels were high, feeding the metabolism of animals and allowing insects to grow to sizes that would seem impossible now. Dragonflies with wingspans over 1/2 metre glided through the forest air. Beetles the size of a hand clung to bark. Each creature had found its role in the breathing system of the planet. Yet, the green world was not always gentle. The same density that supported life also hid danger. Predators moved through the trees silently, using shadow and foliage for cover. Raptors with feathers and sharp claws stalked smaller prey, their eyes keen in the dim light. In the undergrowth, snakes waited in silence. Crocodiles hid along riverbanks, motionless until the moment they struck. Even in the heart of this abundance, survival was never guaranteed. Every leaf and shadow carried both food and threat. For the herbivores, the forest was a constant negotiation. They had to eat almost continuously to sustain their size, but every mouthful carried risk. Some plants evolved chemical defenses, toxins, bitter tastes, or tough fibers to discourage grazing. In response, dinosaurs developed stronger teeth and complex digestive tracts capable of breaking down resistant material. Some species swallowed stones known as gastroliths, which helped grind up food in their stomachs. Evolution was not just shaping bones and claws, it was sculpting the unseen machinery of survival. Water shaped the green world as much as sunlight did. Rainfall patterns determined which plants dominated. In wetter regions, dense jungles spread endlessly. In drier areas, open woodlands and fern plains created different ecosystems. Rivers flooded and receded, leaving behind nutrient-rich mud where new growth sprouted quickly. In the floodplains, entire herds gathered after the rains, feeding on the lush vegetation that appeared almost overnight. The rhythm of rain was as important as the turning of the seasons, and the seasons themselves, though gentle in this greenhouse world, still marked the passage of time. Even without harsh winters, there were cycles: dry and wet, growth and dormancy. Trees dropped leaves, not from cold, but from exhaustion, conserving energy during less favourable months. When the rains returned, buds opened again, and the forest resumed its slow breathing. The animals followed these cues instinctively, migrating or nesting in harmony with the pulse of the environment. The insects were the unsung engineers of this world, pollinators, decomposers, scavengers. They worked continuously to maintain the system. Without them, the flowering plants would have failed to spread. Without the decomposers, fallen vegetation would have smothered the soil. The dinosaurs may have ruled visibly, but the green world answered to smaller masters. Each leaf carried evidence of their work: tiny holes from feeding, trails of larvae, grains of pollen that drifted unseen through the air. It is fascinating to imagine the colours of that world. Unlike the grey-green monotony we often picture from reconstructions, the Cretaceous landscape would have been vibrant. Flowers added splashes of yellows, reds and whites among the ferns. Tree bark carried hues of deep brown, orange and grey. Insects flashed metallic blues and greens as they moved. Feathers shimmered in sunlight. Even fruits and seeds came in bright shades, designed to attract attention. The planet was experimenting with colour, testing how sight could shape evolution. Fossilised leaves from this era show intricate details, veins, textures, and sometimes even the imprints of raindrops. They reveal that plant life had developed complex structures to regulate water and gas exchange. Stomata, the tiny openings on leaves, adapted to varying levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, balancing the intake of air with the loss of moisture. These microscopic adjustments determined how efficiently the green world could function. Every living thing, no matter how large or small, depended on this invisible chemistry. In some regions, the forest gave way to open plains where different forms of vegetation took over. Here, the tall ferns and cycads formed a continuous sea of green that stretched to the horizon. The ground was spongy from decayed matter, the air full of insect noise. Herds of herbivores roamed these spaces, feeding and moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Their grazing kept the vegetation in check, preventing any one species from dominating. The balance between plant and animal was mutual, each controlling and supporting the other. Occasionally fire swept through these plains, ignited by lightning strikes. The flames moved quickly, consuming dry foliage, but the plants were adapted to it. Some seeds only germinated after being exposed to heat. Within weeks of a fire, green shoots would appear again, nourished by the ashes of the old. This cycle of destruction and renewal was another form of the planet's pulse, quieter than the movement of tectonic plates, but just as vital. The green world extended to the edges of the seas as well. Along the coasts, mangrove-like forests and salt-tolerant plants created dense thickets. Their roots stabilized the soil and filtered the water that flowed from rivers into the ocean. These ecosystems were nurseries for fish and amphibians, connecting the land and the sea. The boundaries of the green world were never fixed. They shifted with the tides, blending one environment into another. Even underground, the influence of plants was profound. Roots reached deep into rock, breaking it apart and releasing minerals into the soil. This process, known as weathering, played a crucial role in regulating the planet's atmosphere. As roots and microbes dissolved rock, they helped capture carbon dioxide and store it in new minerals. It was a slow but powerful feedback loop, the green world breathing with the planet itself. The dinosaurs lived within this system, not above it. Their lives depended entirely on the reliability of plant growth. When drought struck, populations fell. When volcanic ash enriched the soil, they flourished. The stability of the green world determined everything. It provided food, shelter, and air. It was the invisible foundation of their age. And though we often think of the Cretaceous in terms of its great animals, it was this web of plant life that truly defined it. Without the forests, there would have been no herds, no migration, no predators. Every roar, every call, every movement of muscle and bone began with sunlight striking a leaf. The green world was the silent engine behind the spectacle of life. The plants of the Cretaceous left behind more than fossils. They left behind the blueprint of modern ecosystems. The forests of today, their structure, their diversity, their chemistry, are echoes of that ancient age. The same relationships that began then continue now. Every flower pollinated, every leaf that falls and decays, every breath of oxygen we take is part of the legacy of that green world. And still, beneath the endless canopy and the weight of leaves, the earth continued to move. The soil shifted, the air warmed, the balance wavered slightly unseen. The creatures of that world did not notice. They lived in the rhythm of growth and hunger, migration and rest. All of it synchronized with the great breathing of the planet itself. The green world carried on, its leaves whispering in the wind, its roots deep in the moving earth, unaware that its age of glory would soon give way to something far darker, not by its own failure, but by a chance event from beyond the sky. The forests of the Cretaceous stretched endlessly, alive with colour and movement, but above the canopy, across the plains, and along the wide floodplains, there was a presence that commanded all attention. The giants. They were the largest creatures ever to walk the earth. Vast bodies of muscle and bone that moved with a weight and grace that defied imagination. To live in the Cretaceous was to live in the shadow of titans. They were not mythical, not exaggerated legends, but real animals whose size alone shaped the environment around them. The green world supported them, and they in turn shaped it. Every path they walked became a trail. Every tree they fed on altered the structure of the forest. They were gardeners on a scale no other creatures could match, consuming tons of vegetation each day, spreading seeds across miles, and creating new openings for sunlight to reach the forest floor. The balance between the earth and its giants was fragile, yet it held for millions of years. If you could stand at the edge of a late Cretaceous plain, you might first hear them before you saw them. The sound was not a roar or a stomp, but a deep vibration, the low rhythmic thud of enormous feet pressing into the ground. The air would tremble slightly, carrying the sound of heavy breathing and the soft swish of tails sweeping through tall ferns. Then, emerging through the haze, you would see them. Long-necked titanosaurs moving in slow procession, their heads rising and falling above the vegetation like ships at sea. These sauropods were the ultimate expression of the dinosaur body plan. Their necks stretched for meters, their bodies massive but balanced, their legs thick and columnar like tree trunks. The largest among them weighed as much as 70 tons, and yet their skeletons were masterpieces of engineering, lightened by air pockets within the bone, allowing them to move with surprising efficiency. They were warm-blooded enough to sustain constant activity, but slow enough to conserve energy. Each step was deliberate, each breath deep and steady. Around them, smaller herbivores moved with quicker, sharper rhythms. Hadrosaurs grazed in herds, their duck-billed snouts sweeping through the low vegetation. They were social creatures, communicating through deep calls that carried across long distances. Fossilized crests found on some species show that they could produce resonant sounds, possibly to signal danger or coordinate movement. Their young stayed close to their sides, protected within the massive bodies that moved like a living wall. Further north, herds of triceratops wandered the floodplains. Their frilled heads and horns made them unmistakable, and their behavior likely mirrored that of modern herd animals. They were powerful but cautious, their senses tuned to the approach of predators. The horns were not just weapons, but tools of communication, displays of dominance, recognition, or even affection. When they locked horns, the sound would echo through the valley, a deep grinding of bone and muscle that left scars even on the fossilized skulls we find today. Predators watched from the edges of this abundance. The most famous among them, Tyrannosaurus rex, was both feared and misunderstood. It was massive, yes, but not reckless. Its body was built for bursts of speed, not endurance. Its sense of smell was among the most acute of any animal in history, capable of detecting prey from miles away. Its bite was strong enough to crush bone, yet its behaviour was not that of a mindless killer. It was an opportunist, a strategist. Sometimes it hunted, sometimes it scavenged. It was a creature finely tuned to the balance of its world. To see a Tyrannosaurus in motion would have been to witness a perfect combination of power and control. The muscles of its legs coiled and released with precision. Its tail counterbalanced every movement. Its head swung side to side as it advanced, eyes locked on motion. There was no wasted effort. Every step was an act of intention. And yet, for all its power, it existed within the same limits as everything else, dependent on the availability of prey, on the fertility of the land, on the pulse of the planet that fed its world. The Age of Titans was not defined by violence, though it contained plenty of it. It was defined by scale. Everything in the Cretaceous seemed larger. The animals, the trees, even the insects. Evolution had found a rhythm that favoured size. In warm climates with high oxygen levels and abundant food, bodies could grow immense without strain. Larger animals retained heat better, could travel farther, and could defend themselves more effectively. Size was both a strategy and a symptom of success, but the size came with consequences. The great herbivores needed constant access to food and water. Their migration shaped the landscape as surely as rivers did. When they moved, they trampled paths that became seasonal corridors, used again and again for generations. Plants along these paths evolved thicker bark or faster growth to recover from the constant feeding. The soil itself was turned and mixed by their weight, aerated by their steps, fertilized by their droppings. The giants were not separate from the ecosystem, they were part of its metabolism. In many ways, the world revolved around them. The predators followed their movements, scavengers fed on their remains. Insects bred in their waste. Even the plants had adapted to their feeding patterns. The age of Titans was a living system, and every heartbeat, every sound, every shadow belonged to that system. At night, the landscape changed. The heat of the day faded, replaced by the steady chorus of insects. The larger animals rested, their silhouettes faintly visible against the moonlit sky. Steam rose from the ground where their warm bodies had lain. Somewhere in the darkness, smaller predators hunted, taking advantage of the stillness. The world of giants did not sleep completely, it only slowed. In the southern continents, the diversity of these titans was extraordinary. South America in particular was home to some of the largest creatures that ever lived. Argentinosaurus, Patagotitan, and Dreadnoughtus moved through ancient floodplains like living mountains. Their fossils show that they travelled in groups, perhaps for protection, perhaps simply because the land could only sustain them if they moved together, feeding and moving on in cycles. Their long necks allowed them to feed on trees that would have been unreachable to smaller herbivores, and their sheer size made them nearly immune to attack. Few predators dared to challenge an adult titan. In Africa, similar giants roamed, though the species differed. The environment was drier there, dotted with wide rivers and seasonal wetlands. The dinosaurs adapted accordingly, with more efficient water retention and varied feeding strategies. Some may have migrated seasonally, following the rains. The air shimmered with heat during the day, and dust hung low near the horizon. Yet even in that harshness, life thrived, bound together by the same patterns of abundance and struggle. Asia was home to an astonishing variety of dinosaurs, from the towering herbivores to agile predators that hunted in groups. Fossils reveal evidence of coordinated hunting, trackways showing multiple individuals moving together in parallel, their footprints preserved in ancient mud. Intelligence, once thought to belong only to small creatures, was a force among the large as well. Predators had to plan, to anticipate the behaviour of prey. The green world was not only a stage for instinct but for strategy. In the forests of North America, the ecosystem was a patchwork of habitats, rivers, floodplains, wooded hills. Each supported its own caste of creatures. In one region, hadrosaurs grazed on low vegetation. In another, ceratopsians clashed among the ferns. Tyrannosaurs prowled at the edges of both, their keen senses guiding them through the landscape. The constant interplay between hunter and prey created an evolutionary arms race that refined every adaptation. Speed, camouflage, armour, intelligence. Even the smallest details of this world reflected its scale. The nests of large herbivores were massive, shallow depressions lined with vegetation, often clustered together in nesting grounds that stretched for kilometres. Fossilised eggs and embryos show that some species cared for their young after hatching, bringing food and guarding them from predators. The bond between parent and offspring, once thought to be rare in prehistoric life, was already a defining behaviour. The continuity of generations depended on care, not just reproduction. The predators too showed signs of complexity. The bones of injured individuals sometimes show evidence of healing, suggesting that they survived long enough to recover, possibly with help from others of their kind. This points to cooperation, social structure, even empathy in forms we can't easily imagine. The Age of Titans was not simply about might, it was about adaptation at every level, physical and social alike. The climate sustained this abundance, but it was beginning to change. The hidden pulse of the planet, the volcanic activity deep beneath the crust, had been steadily altering the composition of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated, causing subtle shifts in temperature and rainfall. Some regions grew wetter, others drier. The great inland seas that once covered vast areas began to shrink in some places and expand in others. Slowly, ecosystems adjusted. The dinosaurs moved with them, following the food, following the water, unaware that the balance was tilting. In the fossil record, these transitions are faint but visible. Layers of sediment record alternating patterns of flood and drought. Plant fossils show changes in dominant species. Flowering plants becoming more common, conifers retreating. The world was evolving, not through sudden catastrophe yet, but through quiet persistence. The giants continued to roam, unaware that they were living in the closing chapter of their age. At their peak, the diversity of dinosaurs was staggering. There were armoured forms with plates and spikes, agile runners built for speed, giants that grazed the canopy, and tiny scavengers that darted through the undergrowth. Each was perfectly adapted to its environment. Evolution had refined the design of the dinosaur over 160 million years, optimizing it for almost every conceivable niche. It is difficult to overstate how successful they were. The Earth had become theirs entirely. The Age of Titans was not only a biological era, but a geological and atmospheric balance that made such creatures possible. The high oxygen content supported their metabolism. The warm, stable temperatures allowed them to breed and grow year-round. The plentiful vegetation sustained their endless hunger. Every aspect of the environment aligned to create a world capable of supporting life on an unprecedented scale. Yet, within that perfection lay vulnerability. The same interconnectedness that made the world so rich also made it fragile. A disruption in one system, the climate, the atmosphere, the plant life, could ripple through everything. The Titans, for all their power, were bound to the balance that sustained them. They could not adapt quickly to a world that shifted too fast. Still, in their time, they were the unchallenged rulers of Earth. They shaped the planet simply by existing. Their footprints pressed deep into the mud, leaving impressions that would harden into fossils, preserved through the ages. Their bones would become part of the Earth's stone, waiting for discovery. Even their breath, rich with carbon dioxide, fed the forest that surrounded them. They were part of the planet's circulation, the living manifestation of its strength. If you could stand among them, you might feel small, but also strangely connected. The air vibrating with the low calls of massive creatures, the ground trembling under their weight, the warmth of sunlight filtering through the haze, all of it would feel alive in a way that is difficult to comprehend now. The scale of that life, the density of it, the sense of being surrounded by living mass would have been overwhelming. The Age of Titans was not a moment of chaos or domination. It was a period of balance, the culmination of millions of years of evolution. The planet had created its masterpiece. Vast, breathing ecosystems powered by sunlight, fueled by growth, held together by the invisible rhythm of the Earth. It was a world at its most alive, and still, beneath it all, the ground continued to move. The pulse of the planet never stopped. The atmosphere shifted slightly. The seas deepened. Far beyond the clouds, something small and distant moved through the dark of space, unnoticed, insignificant against the stars. The Titans went on feeding, breathing, living, unaware that their world, for all its strength, was not built to last forever. The Cretaceous world had been thriving for millions of years. The forests were dense, the seas were full, the air was rich and warm. The great creatures of land, sky and water had settled into a long equilibrium, unaware that anything could ever disturb it. Every day began the same way, sunlight spreading across misted valleys, insects lifting into the air, herds stirring in the early heat. To them, this world must have seemed eternal, but time, even then, was counting down. The last age of the dinosaurs was not yet ending, but it was already late. The final midnight was approaching quietly, hidden behind the illusion of stability. If you could have stood in that time, nothing would have looked wrong. The Earth was alive in every direction. Trees stretched into humid air. Volcanoes smouldered faintly on distant horizons. The seas shimmered with the same light that had reflected off them for ages. Animals moved through their daily cycles, feeding, nesting, migrating, all according to patterns that had worked for millions of generations. The Earth did not warn them. There was no sound of a ticking clock, no sign of approaching disaster. The ending began, like all endings do, invisibly. Beneath that calm surface, however, changes were gathering. Subtle, slow, but steady. The planet's internal pulse had grown louder. Volcanic fields in regions like what would one day become, India had entered an active phase, releasing enormous volumes of gas into the atmosphere. For thousands of years, the Deccan Traps poured lava across the land, creating plateaus hundreds of meters thick. Each eruption filled the air with carbon dioxide and sulfur, altering the balance of the atmosphere. At first, the changes were minor. A few degrees warmer here, a little less rainfall there. But across millions of years, those small shifts added up. The climate of the late Cretaceous began to waver. Some regions grew drier. Rainforests retreated slightly, replaced by open woodlands. Seasons became more pronounced. The lushness that had defined the earlier Cretaceous started to thin, not everywhere, not dramatically, but gradually, like the slow fading of a colour from a painting. Still, life adapted. New plants evolved to handle the changes. The flowering species that had spread across the world diversified even further, thriving where the older cycads and ferns struggled. Evolution did not stop. It never does. It simply adjusted its tempo. For the dinosaurs, these fluctuations were a challenge but not a catastrophe. They had weathered such changes before. When food became scarce in one region, herds moved to another. When rain failed for a season, new migrations began. The predators followed. Life continued to flow along the lines carved by instinct and adaptation. In the short span of a lifetime, nothing seemed unusual. The cycles of birth and death carried on, and the great herds still roamed as they always had. But the environment was becoming more volatile. As the planet's inner fires burned, gases built up in the air and water. The oceans absorbed much of the carbon dioxide, becoming slightly more acidic. Tiny marine organisms that form the base of the food chain, the plankton and shell builders, began to show stress. In some regions, species declined. In others, new forms appeared. The balance shifted subtly, unpredictably. The ocean's chemistry, once stable, started to waver. These were small changes, the kind no animal could notice. Yet they mattered. The Earth was quietly rearranging itself. The continents continued their slow drift. Ocean currents altered their paths. Winds carried moisture differently. Storms grew stronger in some regions, weaker in others. The pattern of life, once perfectly tuned, was beginning to stretch. It didn't break, not yet, but it was under tension. On the surface, everything still looked normal. A late Cretaceous morning would have been bright and full of sound. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. Birds, true descendants of the dinosaurs themselves, called from branches and darted through sunlight. Herds of triceratops grazed along the riverbanks, their horns gleaming with dew. A mother Tyrannosaurus led her young through tall grass, their eyes alert for movement. Across the horizon, pterosaurs wheeled lazily, their silhouettes dark against the sky. The world was alive, completely unaware that it stood on the edge of history's most violent boundary. In these final millennia, the diversity of life was astonishing. More species existed on Earth than at almost any point before. The planet was at its ecological peak, and that is often how endings arrive, not with decline, but with abundance. The richer the system, the more complex the web, the more fragile it becomes when disturbed. The world was filled to its limits, and the smallest imbalance could ripple across everything. In the forests, the air was still thick and warm. Ferns and flowering plants shared the ground in tangled mats. Dragonflies glided above shallow pools. Lizards and small mammals hunted insects in the undergrowth. At night, the air cooled only slightly, heavy with moisture, filled with the faint hum of life continuing its endless rhythm. Every sound, every breath, every footstep carried the illusion of permanence. The dinosaurs were thriving, but some patterns hinted at unease. Fossil evidence from this period shows fluctuations in population sizes. Certain herbivores became less common in some areas, while others grew more dominant. Predators shifted their ranges, perhaps following changing prey. Sea levels fluctuated, drowning some habitats and revealing others. Evolution continued to react to an environment that was no longer predictable. But evolution requires time, and time was running out. Far above this living world, beyond the clouds, beyond the blue haze of atmosphere, a small object had been travelling for a long time. It was ancient, a fragment of rock and metal left over from the formation of the solar system, orbiting silently between worlds. For millions of years it had wandered the outer reaches of space, caught in the slow gravity of planets and the faint pressure of sunlight. It had no destination, no purpose, until something, perhaps the pull of Jupiter's gravity, perhaps a collision long forgotten, sent it on a new course, a line through the dark that intersected perfectly with Earth. No creature on the planet could have seen it coming. The air was clear, the seas calm, the forests peaceful. But in the high reaches of the atmosphere, invisible to all living eyes, that ancient rock was already beginning to glow. Still, on the surface, life went on. The last generations of dinosaurs lived as their ancestors had for millions of years. Herds migrated across open plains. Raptors hunted in coordinated bursts. In the oceans, mosasaurs and plesiosaurs patrolled the depths, unaware that their realm too was part of what would soon change. Even the insects, those tireless survivors of every previous catastrophe, continued their quiet labour, pollinating, decomposing, building, feeding. Nothing in the behaviour of the planet suggested an ending. If anything, the world seemed more alive than ever. The fossil record shows that in the final 1,000 years of the Cretaceous, new species were still evolving. In North America, new varieties of Triceratops appeared. In the seas, ammonites developed increasingly ornate shells. On land, flowering plants continued to diversify, spreading into regions once dominated by older flora. The pulse of evolution did not slow. It never does until it must. The planet itself seemed unaware of its own schedule. Volcanoes erupted sporadically. Rivers meandered through forests. The tides rose and fell. The weather followed its ancient patterns, driven by forces deep within the earth and far beyond it. Everything was normal. Everything was alive. And yet, in the language of geology, the world had entered its last page of that age. The clock had begun its final seconds, though to every living creature those seconds stretched into generations. It's strange to imagine the calm before such an ending. Not the silence before a storm, but the steady, unaware continuation of a life. The great predators sleeping in the shade, the birds tending their nests, the herds grazing beneath the same sun that would soon be obscured. The Earth had seen extinctions before, and it would see them again, but this one would come from outside, from beyond its atmosphere, from a place no creature could ever reach or understand. The approaching object, the asteroid, was still far from sight. It travelled silently, faster than anything Earth had ever known. Its surface was scarred, its body ancient and cold. As it drew closer, the gravity of the planet pulled it faster still. The air ahead of it compressed, heating to temperatures that turned night into day. But none of this had yet happened in the time we were imagining. We are still standing in the last quiet days, when the forests still grew, when the seas still shimmered, when the dinosaurs still ruled the land without rival. The planet from space would have looked beautiful. Green continents, blue oceans, white clouds. The same palette we see today. The patterns of wind and water that shaped the surface were familiar. If you could have watched from orbit, nothing about it would suggest that this was a doomed world. It rotated slowly under the sun, glowing with life, every inch of it busy with growth and motion. But on its path through space, invisible in the endless black, the asteroid was already falling toward it. The final day of the Cretaceous began like any other. The air was warm, the sun bright. In what would one day be called the Yucatan Peninsula, tropical forest stretched toward a shallow sea. The morning light filtered through the canopy, painting the forest floor in golden shadow. Animals moved through the trees, hunting, feeding, calling. The ground was soft from recent rain. The air smelled of earth and salt. There was no reason to notice anything unusual. The planet seemed entirely at peace. A few hours later, a streak appeared in the sky. To any creature that looked up, it would have seemed strange but brief, a bright line across the heavens moving faster than sound. It may have cast shadows even in daylight. Birds scattered from the trees. Some animals looked up, confused by the flash of light that lasted only seconds, and then the world changed forever. The asteroid entered the atmosphere at nearly 70,000 kilometers per hour. The air in front of it compressed violently, heating to temperatures that turned the object into a white-hot sun. It exploded through the sky, leaving behind a column of fire that stretched from space to the surface. In its final seconds, it struck the Earth with the energy of billions of atomic bombs. But that impact, that incomprehensible moment, belongs to what comes next. For now, we are still in the last instant before it happens. The herds are still grazing, the forests are still breathing, the air is still thick with the sounds of life. Every creature on the planet is living its last normal moment. The planet holds its breath, though no one can feel it. The hidden pulse beneath the crust, the rhythms of the green world, the movements of the oceans, all continue in perfect order. The Earth is unaware, just as its inhabitants are unaware, that the clock has struck the invisible hour. In the great scheme of time, it is only a heartbeat, a blink, the final calm before a storm that will erase almost everything. But in that blink, the world is complete, beautiful, alive, and at peace. The last rays of sunlight pass through the forests, through the wings of pterosaurs gliding over the sea, through the scales of a sleeping giant resting beneath the trees. Shadows stretch across the land. The air is still. The day ends like every other. And somewhere above the clouds, unseen, the end of an age is already descending. The asteroid that would end the Cretaceous entered the atmosphere in silence. There was no warning, no tremor, no light visible long enough to interpret. It came from beyond the blue, from the cold dark between worlds, drawn inward by gravity and inevitability. A visitor from the void, ancient, indifferent, carrying no malice and no intention, only momentum. Its story was as old as the solar system itself, a fragment of rock and metal that had drifted for millions of years, a relic of the time when planets were still forming, when everything was collisions and dust and fire. By the time it reached the edge of the atmosphere, it was travelling faster than any sound the Earth had ever produced. The air in front of it didn't have time to move aside. It was crushed, compressed, and heated until it glowed like the surface of the sun. For a moment, the entire sky above what would one day be Mexico became brighter than daylight. Creatures on the ground froze, blinded by the sudden flash. Birds took off in panic. Animals scattered into the forest. In that instant, the planet's surface met an object that had been on its way for tens of millions of years. The impact happened near the shallow waters of the Yucatan Peninsula, where the sea met low coastal forests. The asteroid, about 10 kilometers wide, struck at an angle, releasing an energy beyond comprehension. The blast was equivalent to billions of nuclear explosions. In less than a second, the object vaporized, along with the rock, water, and atmosphere around it. A crater more than 180 kilometers across was gouged into the crust. The bedrock melted. Shock waves rippled outward faster than sound, racing through land and ocean alike. The explosion tore apart the atmosphere. A column of vaporized rock and molten debris shot upward, piercing the sky, rising through the stratosphere and beyond. Within minutes, material from the impact began falling back to Earth as glowing fragments, raining down across continents. The friction of their re-entry turned the upper atmosphere into a furnace. For a short time, perhaps less than an hour, the entire surface of the planet glowed dimly in infrared light, heated by the returning debris. Forests ignited spontaneously. The air shimmered with heat. Everything alive beneath that sky experienced it in a different way. The creatures nearest the impact never had time to know what had happened. The blast wave flattened everything for hundreds of kilometers, leveling forests, boiling seas, and hurling debris across the landscape. Further away, the shock arrived as a wall of wind and sound that tore through the air, toppling trees and scattering herds. Those who survived that first instant faced something worse, a rain of fire. Tiny droplets of molten rock, ejected from the impact and cooled into glass as they fell, rained from the sky for hours. These spherules covered the ground, burned forests, and filled the air with dust and ash. The planet that had been green and bright was suddenly lit by countless fires. Even creatures far from the impact felt the heat. The surface temperature rose sharply, and the air filled with smoke dense enough to blot out the sun. In the oceans, the shock was different but no less devastating. A wave hundreds of meters high raced outward from the impact site. It crossed entire seas, hitting coastlines with unimaginable force. Coral reefs, beaches, and coastal forests were ripped apart. The wave carried debris, rock, trees, carcasses, far inland, then retreated, leaving chaos in its wake. The noise was constant, unending, a low roar that rolled across the planet for days. The fires burned for weeks. Vast regions of forest turned to ash. The smoke mixed with vaporized rock and sulfur from the impact, forming a dense cloud layer that encircled the planet. The sunlight dimmed, then disappeared entirely. The day turned into a dim twilight that lasted for months. Photosynthesis stopped. The green world went silent. Animals that depended on plants for food starved first. Herbivorous dinosaurs, so vast and powerful in life, could not find enough to eat. Their massive bodies, built for abundance, were too large for scarcity. One by one the herds weakened. Predators, deprived of prey, followed. The ecosystems that had thrived for millions of years collapsed in a matter of weeks. The smaller creatures fared better. Mammals, birds, insects and reptiles that could hide, burrow or go dormant stood a chance. Their size became their advantage. They needed less, could survive longer, could eat what others could not. In the darkness, the rules of survival changed. The titans that had ruled the land were no longer suited to the world that remained. The planet had tilted toward the small and the adaptable. The ocean life suffered its own catastrophe. The debris that filled the atmosphere eventually settled into the seas, mixing with acid rain produced by the chemical reactions in the air. The surface waters grew acidic, dissolving the shells of plankton and corals. The foundation of the marine food chain broke apart. For a time, the oceans were quiet, empty of movement except for the slow drifting of the dead. Yet, even in the midst of this devastation, the planet itself continued its slow rhythms. The tectonic plates moved. Volcanoes erupted. Rivers shifted their courses. Life did not stop entirely, it simply hid. Seeds buried in the soil waited for sunlight to return. Burrowing animals clung to the warmth underground. Insects found shelter in the crevices of bark and stone. The earth, though wounded, was still alive. Its hidden pulse continued. After the first few weeks, the fires began to fade. The smoke that had darkened the skies spread across the entire planet, blocking sunlight almost completely. Global temperatures dropped sharply. The heat of the fires gave way to a sudden, bitter cold. The world entered what scientists call an impact winter, a period when the sun's light was so reduced that photosynthesis nearly ceased. For months, perhaps years, the surface of the planet was dim and freezing. Snow fell even in tropical regions. The air grew still, heavy with dust and ash. The once loud world became quiet. The forests, stripped of leaves and branches, stood like blackened skeletons. The great rivers slowed, choked with debris. The ocean's surface cooled and life retreated into the depths. Everything that had thrived in the warmth of the Cretaceous now faced a silence that stretched beyond comprehension. In that silence, the survivors waited. Some creatures, like small mammals, fed on roots, insects, or anything they could find. Birds that could eat seeds endured the darkness longer than those that fed on insects. Crocodiles, turtles, and amphibians survived in the water, their slow metabolisms allowing them to endure scarcity. Life's persistence was not dramatic. It was quiet, cautious, almost invisible. The impact had reshaped the world physically as well. The crater that formed in the Yucatan became a scar hundreds of kilometers wide, later buried under layers of sediment but never gone. The shockwave fractured the crust for thousands of kilometers, triggering volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. Tsunami deposits can still be found in rock layers across continents, evidence of the waves that reached as far as what is now North America's interior. The planet itself bore the memory of the event in every layer of stone. Months passed, then years. The dust in the atmosphere slowly began to settle. Sunlight, faint and filtered, returned in thin beams. The fires were gone, replaced by frost. The earth was no longer warm and humid, it was pale and dry. The great age of dinosaurs was over, but the planet itself remained. When sunlight finally returned fully, it was weak at first. The atmosphere had been permanently changed. The high levels of carbon dioxide and sulfur altered the climate, making it unpredictable. The forest did not regrow evenly. Some areas recovered, others stayed barren. But wherever life had managed to survive, in burrows, in the deep sea, in seeds, it began to emerge again. The first green shoots appeared on the ashen ground, small and fragile but alive. The age that followed would belong to the descendants of those survivors. Mammals, which had lived in the shadows for so long, began to diversify. Birds, the only surviving dinosaurs, filled the skies that had once belonged to their ancestors. The Earth began to rebuild, slowly, patiently, as it always had. But for a long time, the silence remained. The extinction that followed the impact wiped out about 3/4 of all species on Earth. Almost every large animal vanished. The dinosaurs that had ruled the land, the great reptiles of the seas, the flying pterosaurs, all gone. The world that emerged after was smaller, emptier, but open to new possibilities. The planet had turned a page, not out of choice, but because that is what time does. The visitor from the void had not intended destruction. It was a simple consequence of motion, of physics, of chance. It carried no awareness of what it had done. After striking the Earth, most of it vaporized, becoming part of the air and water it destroyed. The rest sank into the molten rock beneath the crater. Its journey ended, but the story it triggered continued for millions of years. In the grand scale of time, the impact was brief. Seconds of violence that reshaped the planet for eons. The age of Titans ended in fire and darkness, and from that darkness the future began. Every species that exists now traces its survival, directly or indirectly, to those few that endured the aftermath. The world we live in is the child of that catastrophe. Even now, the Earth remembers. Layers of clay enriched with iridium, a metal rare on the planet's surface but common in asteroids, mark the boundary and rock formations across the globe. It is a line that separates two eras, the world before, filled with giants, and the world after, filled with new beginnings. To stand before that line in stone is to look at the moment when everything changed. For the planet, it was another transformation in a long series. For life, it was the Great Reset. The visitor from the void had come and gone, leaving behind silence, darkness, and eventually renewal. If you imagine the Earth in the weeks after, spinning slowly under a dim sky, you would see a planet wrapped in shadow. The oceans would reflect little light. The continents would be grey and bare. The sound of life would be faint. The scurrying of small creatures, the whisper of wind through dead trees, the soft lapping of waves against empty shores. But somewhere in that silence, life was still breathing. The same stubborn, patient force that had survived every previous extinction was already beginning to move again. It is easy to see the impact as an ending, but in the language of the planet it was a change. The Earth does not grieve, and it does not remember the way we do. It simply continues. Its pulse, hidden deep within, never faltered. The continents drifted, the seas calmed, the air cleared, and in time the sunlight returned and the world began again. What the dinosaurs left behind was not just bones, but the foundation for what would come next. The mammals that would fill the forests, the birds that would sing in the air, the plants that would evolve into the landscapes we know. The visitor from the void had brought destruction, but it had also cleared the way for a new story. The Earth, in its vastness, turned tragedy into renewal. Above the planet, the stars continued to burn, silent and distant, unaware of what had happened to one small world among billions. The asteroid belt from which the visitor had come remained. Other fragments drifted still, their orbits crossing paths that might, one day, intersect again. But for now the void was quiet. The Earth spun slowly beneath the remnants of its own fire, waiting for the light to return. And when it did, faint and golden through the clearing air, the planet looked unchanged to the universe. It still glowed blue and white and green. It still turned under the same sun. But everything upon it had changed forever. It began as a bright streak across a clear sky, a line of light that moved too fast for the eye to follow, too silent to warn what was coming. For the creatures below it was nothing more than a passing brightness, a curiosity glimpsed between the leaves or reflected in still water. The herds didn't stop feeding, the birds didn't stop calling. The air was warm and full of life, yet in that same moment the balance that had lasted for millions of years was about to disappear. The day the sky fell was not a slow unravelling. It was a single instant when everything changed. The asteroid entered the atmosphere at 70,000 kilometers per hour. It was already glowing white hot, its surface vaporizing as it met the resistance of air. The friction produced a column of plasma that stretched from space to the ground, heating the air to thousands of degrees. Before it even touched the Earth, shockwaves rippled outward, flattening the sky itself. And then, in a flash shorter than a heartbeat, the asteroid struck. The point of impact was a shallow sea in what would one day be the Yucatan Peninsula. The explosion released energy equivalent to 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. The asteroid itself was obliterated instantly, its mass converted into heat and shock. The ground at the impact site vaporized. Rock melted and flowed like liquid. The air turned to fire. The pressure wave expanded outward faster than sound, tearing through the atmosphere in all directions. If you were anywhere within 1,000 kilometers, you would not have seen it, only light, so intense it burned before you could look away. The forests ignited instantly. Trees vaporized into flame. Animals caught in the open disintegrated where they stood. Even hundreds of kilometers from the impact, the blast flattened everything in its path. The wave moved at supersonic speed, tearing the air apart, creating winds more powerful than any storm in the planet's history. The shock continued through the ground, triggering earthquakes across continents. Mountains quivered, rivers changed direction. The crust of the earth flexed like a drum. The sea itself was lifted, displaced outward, sending waves hundreds of meters high, racing across the globe. Coastlines vanished. Islands disappeared beneath walls of water. The entire planet shook as if the core itself had been struck. Above, the sky was a furnace. The impact had thrown trillions of tons of molten rock and vapor into space. For a moment, the planet was surrounded by a halo of glowing debris, a ring of incandescent dust that encircled the Earth. Much of it fell back within hours, re-entering the atmosphere as a rain of fire. These fragments, some no larger than grains of sand, heated the air through friction. The entire upper atmosphere burned. From pole to pole, the air glowed red-orange, and the surface of the planet was bathed in infrared heat strong enough to ignite forests across continents. Even those far from the blast felt the heat. Temperatures at ground level rose suddenly, not from sunlight, but from the atmosphere itself. Plants curled and blackened. Animals fled in confusion, seeking shade where there was none to be found. The fires spread rapidly, merging into vast infernos that consumed everything from coast to mountain. Smoke rose in colossal plumes, joining the dust and vapour already filling the air. Within hours, the sky that had been bright blue turned dark and turbulent. At sea, the devastation took a different form. The impact had vaporized the shallow waters of the Gulf, sending superheated steam into the atmosphere. The waves that followed were immense, travelling at the speed of a jet. When they reached other shores, the coasts of North America, Africa, Europe, they were still tens of meters high. The force of the water scoured everything in its path, carving new shorelines and depositing sediments that would one day become layers of rock, silent records of the flood. The creatures of the ocean suffered as well. The initial blast boiled the water near the impact site. Everything within hundreds of kilometers was cooked instantly. Further out, the waves churned the seas, stirring up sediments and driving oxygen from the water. Marine life that had survived the heat soon faced suffocation. Coral reefs shattered. The great marine reptiles that had ruled the oceans for millions of years, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, were thrown into chaos. The shockwave disoriented them, ruptured their organs, broke their world apart. The air, once filled with the sounds of insects and birds, fell silent. The fires burned through forests that had stood for centuries. The smell of smoke and burning resin filled the atmosphere. The planet's great carbon stores, the trees, the soil, the vegetation, released their gases in one vast exhalation. The sky, now thick with soot and ash, began to block the sun. Within days, the light faded. At first, it was a dimming. The sun shrouded as if by thick clouds. Then over weeks, the light weakened further. The atmosphere, loaded with dust, sulphur and carbon, became nearly opaque. Day and night merged into a perpetual twilight. Temperatures fell rapidly. Rain began to fall, mixed with ash and acid, washing soot into rivers and seas. This was the beginning of the long darkness, an impact winter that would last for years. In that darkness, the survivors clung to what warmth they could find. Small mammals stayed in burrows, their metabolism slowed, feeding on stored food or scavenging what they could. Some birds sought shelter in hollows and caves, waiting for light to return. Crocodiles and turtles, protected by their ability to live in cold water and go long periods without food, endured in silence. Insects and worms continued their work underground, breaking down the dead. Life, reduced to embers, waited for the fire to pass. Above the ground, the fires continued to burn wherever oxygen and fuel remained. The glow of flames flickered faintly through the thick haze, reflecting off clouds of smoke that wrapped the planet. The heat trapped beneath those clouds alternated with the cold above, creating turbulent winds that spread soot across every continent. The world became a furnace followed by a freezer, a cycle of extremes no creature had ever known. In some places, volcanic activity increased in the aftermath. The impact had disturbed the crust so deeply that it triggered eruptions thousands of kilometers away. The Deccan traps, already active, flared with new intensity, pouring more gases into the air. The combination of impact debris and volcanic emissions filled the atmosphere with sulfur aerosols that reflected sunlight and cooled the Earth even further. The temperature drop was sudden, perhaps by more than 10 degrees Celsius within months. The plants died first. Without sunlight, photosynthesis stopped. Leaves fell. Seeds waited in vain for warmth to return. The lush green world that had fed the dinosaurs vanished. Herbivores starved, their skeletons scattered in the ash. Predators followed, their dominance meaningless without prey. The ecosystems that had taken millions of years to build collapsed in months. The oceans, deprived of sunlight, suffered too. Phytoplankton, the microscopic plants that formed the base of marine food webs, could no longer survive in the darkened waters. With them gone, everything above them starved. Fish, ammonites, marine reptiles, all declined rapidly. The once living seas turned still, and yet, even in that silence, life persisted. Some forms of plankton survived in deeper waters, feeding on chemicals rising from the ocean floor. Bacteria thrived around volcanic vents, using heat and minerals to sustain themselves. On land, spores and seeds lay dormant, waiting for the chance to sprout. The planet was wounded, but not dead. The impact dust took years to settle. Each day, less sunlight reached the surface. Each night, the cold deepened. Glaciers formed briefly near the poles. Rain turned to snow even in regions that had once been tropical. The Earth entered a kind of suspended state, neither alive nor lifeless, a world in recovery from trauma. The air was thin and acrid. The ground was littered with ash. The oceans were dark and cold. But beneath the surface, beneath the ruins of the biosphere, life's mechanisms continued their quiet work. Eventually gravity and time began to clear the sky. The larger particles fell first, creating layers of clay that would one day mark this event in stone. The fine dust lingered longer, keeping the world dim but no longer black. Slowly, over years, the light returned. The first sunrise after the impact would have been faint, filtered through haze, the sun a dull orange disk instead of the brilliant gold it once was. But even that light was enough to begin renewal. The surviving plants responded first. Seeds that had lain buried began to germinate. Ferns were among the first to return, their spores spreading quickly across the barren land. Fossil records show what paleontologists call a fern spike, layers of fossilized spores marking the brief dominance of ferns in the years after the impact. They grew where nothing else could, stabilizing soil and preparing it for the forest that would come later. With the plants returned, the air changed again. Oxygen levels began to rise. Small insects reappeared. The smallest mammals, those that had survived in burrows and hollows, ventured out. They fed on insects, roots, and carrion. The world was quiet, subdued, stripped of its giants, but it was alive again. The Earth did not recover evenly. Some regions remained wastelands for centuries, others rebounded more quickly. The patterns of rainfall and temperature had shifted permanently. Entire ecosystems were gone, replaced by new ones that evolved from the remnants. The world that emerged was familiar but altered, a reset planet. The day the sky fell had ended the age of the dinosaurs, but it had not ended life. It had forced it to change, to begin again under new rules. The survivors became the ancestors of everything that would follow. The mammals that would diversify into new forms, the birds that would carry the legacy of the dinosaurs into the future, the plants that would rebuild the green world from its ashes. The sky that had once been filled with fire cleared eventually. The stars returned, dim at first, then bright again. The same constellations that the dinosaurs had unknowingly lived beneath shone on a new world, one quieter, colder and smaller, but full of potential. The Earth had endured another transformation, as it always had, and the memory of that day would remain in its rocks forever. In the stillness that followed, the planet spun on, its hidden pulse unchanged. The crust cooled, the seas calmed, the atmosphere settled, the ashes fell like snow, covering the bones of the titans and the ruins of the forests. Time began its slow work of forgetting. What had been a single day of destruction would become, in the language of geology, a thin line between ages. The moment when one world ended and another began. The day the sky fell was the end of everything that had been familiar for over 100 million years. Yet, in that ending, the seeds of all future life had already been sown. The sunlight returned, faint but real, and the earth, as it always does, began to heal. After the fire and the thunder faded, after the shock waves stopped echoing through the crust, there was silence. The planet, once full of movement and sound, had gone still. The fires that had swept across the continents had burned everything they could reach. The skies were thick and dark, filled with smoke and ash that blotted out the sun. The air was heavy with the scent of soot and minerals. The residue of forest turned to dust. This was the beginning of the long night. For days, the world remained dim, the sky a dull red-brown that never brightened. Then even that faded to grey, and finally to black. The sunlight could no longer penetrate the clouds of dust and debris suspended high in the stratosphere. Across every continent, temperatures began to drop. The air that had been hot enough to ignite wood now cooled faster than the surviving creatures could adapt. The warmth of the Cretaceous vanished in weeks, replaced by a deep, unrelenting chill. The long night after the impact was not simply darkness. It was absence of light, of heat, of sound. The forest stood as blackened skeletons, their trunks stripped of bark and leaves. The seas reflected nothing. The wind moved in slow, irregular currents, carrying fine ash that settled in layers across the land. Each particle was a memory of what had burned. In that darkness, the rhythm of life slowed to almost nothing. The great dinosaurs that had dominated the planet were gone. Their bones lay buried in the ash, still warm from the fires that had consumed them. The giants that had fed on trees, the predators that had ruled the plains, the creatures of the seas and skies, all had vanished. What remained was a planet emptied of its familiar voices. Yet not all life ended. Some forms had found shelter before the firestorm. In burrows beneath the earth, small mammals huddled together, their bodies pressed for warmth. They lived on stored seeds, on roots, on the remains of insects that had also hidden underground. Their metabolism slowed to conserve energy, their hearts beating in rhythm with the fading warmth of the soil. They were not the rulers of this world, not yet. They were its survivors. In the water, crocodiles and turtles endured, their slow bodies suited to starvation and cold. They could remain motionless for months, waiting. Amphibians burrowed into the mud of dried lakes, their skin absorbing what little moisture remained. Insects, always resilient, retreated into the cracks of stone and bark, their eggs sealed against the cold. Bacteria and fungi thrived on the vast decay that now covered the earth. Life did not stop. It only withdrew, conserving itself in silence. The oceans had turned dark and acidic. The debris from the impact rained down for months, mixing with the water, forming carbonic acid that corroded shells and coral. The upper layers of the sea, once alive with plankton, grew empty. The food chains collapsed. Only in the depths, near volcanic vents, did ecosystems remain stable. There, far below the reach of sunlight, chemosynthetic life continued, bacteria feeding on minerals and heat, forming the foundation for worms, crustaceans, and strange creatures adapted to the darkness. They had no need for the sun. Their world was ancient, self-contained, untouched by the chaos above. On land, the ash settled in thick blankets, smothering what had survived the flames. Rivers clogged with silt and debris, their waters turning sluggish and opaque. The air, once warm and heavy with the scent of plants, smelled now of sulphur and wet stone. Acid rain fell steadily, washing the soot from the atmosphere but poisoning the ground in the process. Lakes turned black. The first snow fell soon after, fine and grey mixed with ash, covering the world in a strange stillness. The long night stretched into months. In some places, the darkness was so complete that even the stars were invisible. The atmosphere was choked with dust high enough to scatter starlight before it reached the ground. Creatures that once relied on sight moved clumsily through the dark, guided by smell, touch, or memory. Many failed to find food or shelter and died quietly, their bodies becoming part of the new soil forming across the world. The silence that followed was absolute. There were no calls of birds, no rustling of leaves, no hum of insects. The only sounds were wind and the distant cracking of cooling rock. The earth seemed suspended between its old life and the new one that had not yet begun. The planet still turned beneath the shroud of dust, but its rotation brought no dawn, no warmth, no colour. Time continued, but the distinction between day and night was gone. In this darkness, the survivors evolved behaviours that would define their descendants. Some mammals learned to dig deeper, extending their tunnels to find warmth and protection. Others began to forage in the ashes, feeding on carcasses left by the fires. Their senses sharpened, smell, hearing, touch, adapting to a world where sight was almost useless. These instincts would endure long after the darkness lifted. The small reptiles that survived did so by patience, their metabolisms slowed to a near halt. They could survive on almost nothing, conserving energy through stillness. Birds that had adapted to eat seeds outlived those that relied on insects or fruit. The first true avian survivors of this catastrophe were those whose diets and behaviour matched the conditions of scarcity, the ancestors of the birds we know today. The Earth cooled further. Without sunlight, the planet's energy balance collapsed. The heat once trapped by the atmosphere escaped into space. Snow spread from the poles toward the equator, not in deep drifts, but in thin, persistent layers that reflected what little light remained. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees. The Cretaceous warmth was gone. The age of greenhouse air had ended, replaced by a chill that reached even the deepest valleys. Fossil evidence from this time reveals the extent of the collapse. In the sedimentary layers that mark the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, there is a thin band rich in iridium, a metal rare on Earth but common in asteroids. Below it lie the remains of the Old World. Abundant fossils, traces of plants, diverse microfauna. Above it, for a time, almost nothing. A silence recorded in stone. The long night left its shadow not only in life but in the Earth itself, and yet, even as the cold deepened, the planet began to recover in small, imperceptible ways. The dust that had blocked the sun slowly began to settle. The heaviest particles fell first, forming layers of clay that blanketed the ground. Lighter ash lingered longer, drifting across oceans and continents before sinking into the soil. The air cleared gradually, enough for a dim orange light to filter through the haze. It was not bright, but it was something. The first sunrise after months of darkness would have been strange. Weak, distorted, but real. For the survivors, it marked a turning point. With light came warmth, though faint and inconsistent. The snow began to melt in patches. Streams reappeared, carrying black water thick with soot. Seeds that had lain dormant began to stir. Ferns were the first to return. Their spores spread easily, carried by wind and water, germinating in the nutrient-rich ash. They covered the barren ground in soft green within a few seasons, a living carpet that captured sunlight and restored oxygen to the air. The fossil record shows this phase clearly, an overwhelming dominance of ferns marking the first recovery of plant life. Where ferns grew, insects followed. Beetles, flies, and ants emerged from hiding, feeding on decaying matter and new growth. Spiders returned to the shadows, spinning webs between the skeletal remains of fallen trees. The air filled once again with motion, faint at first, then more constant. Each returning insect marked a step toward renewal. Small mammals ventured out from their burrows. Their eyes squinted in the weak light, their noses twitching at unfamiliar scents. The world they found was unrecognizable, silent, grey and empty, but it belonged to them now. They fed on insects, roots, and the occasional carcass. Some climbed the stumps of burned trees, exploring the open space that had once been dense forest. The absence of larger predators gave them freedom they had never known. Birds followed, emerging from hidden nests. Those that survived the long night began to spread, feeding on seeds and small prey. Their calls returned to the air, tentative at first, then stronger. Sound began to fill the silence again. The earth was waking slowly, cautiously, but unmistakably. The oceans were slower to heal. It took centuries for the chemistry of the water to stabilize. Once the dust settled and sunlight penetrated the surface again, phytoplankton began to reappear. Their return was the beginning of everything. From them came oxygen, food, and balance. The first blooms were small, patchy, but within a few thousand years they had spread across the seas once more. The marine world followed the same quiet pattern as the land. Slow revival, small steps, resilience born of simplicity. Even as life returned, the planet was different. The climate was cooler, the air thinner, the sunlight sharper after passing through an altered atmosphere. The lush humidity of the Cretaceous was gone. In its place came a world of seasons, of contrast. Wet and dry, cold and warm. The balance that had allowed the great reptiles to thrive was broken forever. In its absence, something new began to take shape. The mammals, once small and unremarkable, began to change. With no giant predators to keep them in check, they diversified quickly. Some grew larger, others specialized, digging, climbing, swimming. Their intelligence and adaptability became the tools of survival in a world that no longer rewarded size but versatility. Evolution moved faster now, filling the empty spaces left behind by the dinosaurs. The long night, which had seemed endless, gave way to a slow dawn. The sun rose higher each day. The air cleared. The plants grew taller. Forests began to return, though they were not the same as before. New species of flowering plants took root, spreading across continents. The world had reset, its ecosystems rebuilt from the simplest survivors upward. In the layers of rock that record this time, there is no clear line between destruction and renewal. The two are intertwined. The same processes that ended one age made the next possible. The fire that destroyed the forests enriched the soil for the new ones. The cold that wiped out species made room for others better suited to change. The silence that followed the impact was not just an ending. It was space for the beginning that followed. From space, the Earth would have looked normal again long before life fully recovered. The clouds cleared, the oceans shone blue, the continents greened slowly. But beneath that surface, the structure of the living world had been rewritten. The long night after the impact had ended an era that had lasted for 160 million years. What came after would be something entirely different. And even as the world warmed again, even as forests returned and animals multiplied, traces of that night remained everywhere. In the soil, in the oceans, in the DNA of every survivor there was memory, not of fear or pain, but of endurance. The planet had passed through fire and shadow and come out changed, smaller, quieter, but still alive. The long night was over, but its echo continued, in the rhythm of seasons, in the adaptation of species, in the understanding that even the greatest empires of life are temporary. The Earth kept turning, the sun rose higher, and the survivors carried the story forward, unaware of the age they were about to create. When the light finally returned to the Earth, it revealed a world unrecognizable from the one that had come before. The long night had stripped the planet bare, leaving behind a canvas of ash and stone. The forests were gone, the seas were quieter, and the air was thinner and cooler. What life remained moved slowly, cautiously, as though testing the edges of survival itself. The giants had vanished, their bones buried in the new soil forming from layers of dust and time. What remained were the survivors, the small, the quiet, the unnoticed. They were not the rulers of this new world, not yet. They were its remnants, its inheritors by chance and resilience. In the stillness that followed extinction, the future belonged to those who could endure the emptiness. The world's pulse had not stopped, but it beat more softly now, measured and faint beneath the shifting crust. And upon that subdued earth, life began to rebuild. The first signs of recovery were faint, almost invisible. Ferns spread quickly across the land, their spores carried by wind into every open space. They grew in thick mats over the ash, their roots stabilizing the fragile soil. Their return gave the planet a new shade of green, duller, lower to the ground but alive. Insects returned soon after, feeding on decay and new vegetation. Beetles, ants and flies adapted easily to the cooler air and the new plants. With them came spiders and other small predators, rebuilding the lower layers of the food chain. The foundations of ecosystems formed again quietly, unnoticed by any eye that could see their importance. The animals that had survived the impact came out cautiously. They were creatures of the edges, burrowers, scavengers, opportunists. The world they emerged into was one of silence and opportunity. With the great predators gone, no single species dominated. Each pocket of life grew according to what the environment would allow, and in that openness, evolution found new directions to explore. Mammals were among the most successful survivors. Before the impact, they had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs, small nocturnal creatures that fed mostly on insects, seeds or eggs. They had learned how to hide, how to adapt quickly, how to survive with little. These were the traits that saved them. In a world of scarcity, they could live on almost anything. Their ability to regulate body temperature, their intelligence and their social behaviour gave them advantages in a landscape that had lost its stability. Most of these early mammals were small, no larger than rats or rabbits. They lived in burrows or crevices, venturing out only when necessary. Some species fed on insects, others on plants or carrion. Fossil evidence suggests that many of them were generalists, able to shift their diets depending on what was available. This flexibility was crucial. In a world that changed so drastically from year to year, specialization was dangerous. Versatility meant survival. Birds too endured. The ones that survived were not the large gliding species of the open skies, but smaller, ground-dwelling or seed-eating forms. Their ability to fly gave them mobility, allowing them to seek food and shelter across wide areas. Their feathers, which had once evolved for flight and display, now provided insulation against the cold. In the ashes of the Cretaceous, they found refuge among fallen trunks and sparse vegetation. They nested in the remnants of forests, building small colonies where the sunlight returned. These birds were the bridge between two ages, the last link to the world of the dinosaurs and the first voices of the new era. Reptiles survived as well, though fewer in number. Crocodiles and turtles, creatures of endurance and patience, weathered the crisis with little change. Their slow metabolisms allowed them to survive long periods without food. They retreated into rivers, lakes, and coastal swamps where water buffered the extremes of temperature. When warmth returned, they emerged to bask in the pale sunlight, unchanged while the world around them had transformed. Their survival was not innovation but persistence, an echo of deep evolutionary success. Insects flourished again quickly, as they always have. Their small size, rapid reproduction, and adaptability made them nearly immune to extinction. They became the engineers of recovery, decomposing the dead, pollinating the new plants, and providing food for everything that followed. The hum of insect life, faint at first, grew louder with each passing generation, until it filled the forest once more. It was the sound of the earth restarting itself. In the oceans, life took longer to recover. The extinction had wiped out much of the plankton that formed the base of the marine food web. Without them, fish and larger sea creatures starved. But in the depths, where sunlight had never mattered, chemosynthetic bacteria around volcanic vents continued their ancient routines, producing energy from minerals. These ecosystems, untouched by the impact's effects, became the seeds from which marine life would regrow. Over centuries, plankton species adapted to the new chemistry of the oceans. Once they returned, the rest followed. Small fish, crustaceans, mollusks. Slowly, the seas filled again. The Earth itself was still changing. The tectonic plates continued their steady drift. Volcanic activity remained high for a time, releasing gases that warmed the atmosphere and ended the impact winter. As the air cleared and the planet heated, the climate stabilized into something new, cooler than before, but balanced. The old world of constant warmth and humidity was gone. Seasons began to emerge, faint at first but distinct, marking a shift toward the climate patterns that still shape life today. On land, evolution accelerated. The ecosystems were empty enough for experimentation. Mammals diversified rapidly. Some remained small and insectivorous. Others grew larger, exploring new diets and behaviours. Within a few million years, there were herbivores that grazed on ferns and early flowering plants, and predators that hunted them. The age of the dinosaurs had ended, but the age of mammals had begun. Fossil layers from this time show the explosion of diversity. Jawbones, teeth, and skulls appear in abundance, each shaped for a slightly different way of life. Some species developed stronger jaws for chewing tough vegetation. Others evolved nimble limbs for climbing or running. The world was reorganizing itself through survival and adaptation. Every species that emerged carried the memory of scarcity in its body. Efficient metabolism, sharp senses, careful use of energy. The new forests were different from the ones that had fallen. Flowering plants now dominated, spreading quickly through seeds carried by wind, water, and animals. They produced fruit to attract dispersers, a partnership that would define much of future evolution. The relationship between plants and animals deepened. Where the Cretaceous forests had been ruled by size, these new forests were ruled by complexity. The connections between species grew tighter, more interdependent, more subtle. As the plants returned, the air changed once more. Carbon dioxide levels, elevated by the fires and volcanic activity, began to decline as vegetation captured it again. Oxygen levels rose slowly. The atmosphere cleared, becoming thinner and cooler. The sunlight, now filtered through less haze, was sharper and brighter. It illuminated a planet covered not in giants, but in intricate webs of small life. The scale had shifted, but the vitality remained. It is remarkable to imagine this world, quiet, but full of motion. The rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth replaced the thunder of giant footsteps. The air that had once echoed with the calls of massive predators now carried the chirps and hums of insects and birds. Rivers ran clear again, their banks lined with new vegetation. The soil was rich with ash and nutrients, the legacy of the destruction that had preceded it. The earth had changed its voice, but not its song. The survivors of the shadow did not emerge unscarred. Each lineage bore the marks of the catastrophe. The mammals carried the instinct to burrow, to hide, to store, to survive through uncertainty. The birds retained the caution of their ancestors, the quickness to flee, the awareness of sudden change. The reptiles kept their patience, their ability to endure long periods of stillness. Even the plants evolved resilience, seeds that could wait through years of darkness, roots that could withstand drought or flood. Every form of life that persisted after the impact was in some way shaped by that long night. In time, balance returned. Forests spread across continents. Rivers and lakes stabilized. The oceans teemed again with life. The planet, once dark and empty, became vibrant and green. But it was not the same world. The ecosystems were new, the rules rewritten. The age of reptiles was over. The age of mammals had begun in earnest. From this quiet rebirth would come the ancestors of all the creatures that would later populate the Earth: primates, whales, elephants, horses, and eventually us. The boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene was not just a line in stone, it was a transformation in the fabric of life itself. Before it lay a world of giants and simplicity, after it a world of intricacy and adaptability. The survivors had inherited a planet both wounded and fertile. The catastrophe that had nearly erased them had also cleared the path for everything that would come after. In the slow passage of millions of years, the traces of the disaster faded. The crater filled with sediment. The ash turned to soil. The bones of the dinosaurs became fossils buried deep beneath layers of rock. But the descendants of the survivors carried their legacy forward, reshaping the Earth once more in new ways. The resilience that had saved them became the driving force of evolution. From a distance, from the cold silence of space, the Earth looked the same as it always had. It spun beneath its sun, blue and white, wrapped in clouds. But its surface told a different story, one of death and renewal, of fragility and endurance. The shadow that had once covered it had lifted, leaving behind a new beginning. The survivors of the shadow did not know they were the future. They did not know that they carried in their small, fragile bodies the blueprint for an entirely new world. They only lived, as life always does, from one moment to the next, eating, hiding, growing, adapting. The planet had changed around them, but its hidden pulse still beat, steady as ever, reminding them that even after the darkest night, the Earth always finds its light again. And so it did. The forests grew tall once more. The seas filled with colour. The air warmed. Life continued, smaller perhaps, quieter but persistent, resilient and endlessly inventive. The shadow had passed, but its memory lingered in every living thing, not as fear, but as proof that life endures, no matter how deep the night may become. When the long shadow of extinction finally began to fade, the first light of the new age came quietly. There was no sudden burst of colour, no instant transformation of the world. It began with the smallest things: a patch of ferns spreading across blackened soil, the return of insects to the air, the sound of wind moving through young leaves that had only just begun to form. The Earth was not rushing to heal. It was recovering in the slow, patient rhythm that defines everything living and geological alike. The dawn after extinction was more than sunlight returning to the sky. It was the slow reawakening of systems that had been broken. The carbon cycle, the water cycle, the balance of oxygen and nitrogen, all had been disrupted. The fires and the cold had altered everything. The oceans were still adjusting to new chemical compositions. The atmosphere still held traces of sulfur and dust. But the planet had begun to settle. Gravity, wind and rain resumed their long repetitive work, smoothing the scars left by the asteroid strike. The world, in its quiet way, was rebuilding itself. In the first years after the impact, the survivors lived in isolation. The population of life on Earth had been reduced to a fraction of what it once was. Each small ecosystem existed like an island, separated by distance, climate and circumstance. But as the skies cleared and warmth returned, the boundaries began to dissolve. Seeds travelled on wind currents across continents. Rivers carried nutrients into the seas. Animals migrated into new territories. The empty world began to fill again. The first true forests of the New Age were not like those of the Cretaceous. The old families of trees, the great conifers, the cycads, the towering seed ferns, were fewer now. In their place grew flowering plants, angiosperms quick to spread, quick to evolve. Their seeds travelled easily, carried by wind, water and animals. Their flowers invited insects, and their fruits fed the new mammals and birds that had survived the dark. These plants shaped the world that followed, turning bare ground into lush ecosystems within a few million years. The early mammals, freed from the domination of the dinosaurs, adapted swiftly to their new opportunities. Some species grew larger, no longer confined to burrows and shadows. Others diversified into forms that could climb, swim, or glide. Fossils show how rapidly they evolved, their bones changing shape, their teeth adapting to new diets, their bodies adjusting to different climates. In just a short geological span, they had spread across every continent. They were no longer survivors, they were pioneers of a new order. Among them were the ancestors of modern species. Small, fur-covered creatures with sharp senses and quick movements. Their brains were proportionally larger than those of most reptiles, giving them an edge in memory and behaviour. They lived in family groups, protecting their young, foraging together. Cooperation and care had become part of survival. The traits that would one day define mammals, intelligence, adaptability, emotional complexity, began as necessities in a world that required constant adjustment. The birds, too, expanded into the vacant skies. The large flying reptiles, the pterosaurs, were gone, leaving the air open for their smaller descendants. The surviving bird lineages filled every available niche. Some adapted for long-distance flight, others for diving, climbing, or scavenging. The skies, empty for a time, were soon alive again with movement. The sound of wings replaced the silence that had hung over the earth. The reptiles that endured, though fewer, continued their slow and steady existence. Crocodiles occupied rivers and swamps, just as they had before the impact. Turtles remained nearly unchanged, their forms already perfected for endurance. Lizards diversified into countless species, small and quick, filling the spaces between mammals and birds. Evolution did not favour size anymore. It favoured flexibility. The age of giants had ended. The age of adaptability had begun. Insects, ever the quiet builders of worlds, flourished beyond measure. They pollinated the new plants, broke down organic matter, and recycled nutrients back into the soil. Their presence was invisible from afar, but essential to everything that grew. Ants formed complex colonies underground. Beetles fed on decaying wood. Butterflies and bees evolved alongside the flowering plants, creating the partnerships that would come to define much of Earth's later ecosystems. The hum of insect life became, once again, the background rhythm of the planet. The oceans, still recovering from the devastation, began to glow with life again. The plankton that had nearly disappeared during the impact winter returned, blooming in vast numbers across the surface waters. Their photosynthesis renewed the oxygen supply of the atmosphere. Small fish fed on them, followed by larger predators, and slowly the marine food chains were rebuilt. Coral reefs reappeared where the waters warmed, forming colonies that would one day rival those of the Cretaceous in beauty and diversity. The planet's blue expanses regained their colour, their sparkle, their motion. As life expanded, so did the complexity of ecosystems. The early Paleogene period, the geological age that followed the Cretaceous, was a time of experimentation. Evolution was quickened by the empty world. There were no old hierarchies to maintain, no dominant species to suppress change. Every ecological niche was open, and life moved swiftly to fill it. Some species flourished briefly, then vanished. Others stabilized and spread, giving rise to new branches on the tree of life. It was a period of constant creation, each adaptation building upon another, forming the foundations of the modern world. The climate, while cooler than the greenhouse warmth of the Cretaceous, remained mild overall. The poles were largely ice-free, covered in forests of pine and birch. The equatorial regions were humid, with vast wetlands and dense vegetation. The air was cleaner than it had been in millions of years. The fires were gone, the ash long since washed into the oceans. Rain fell regularly, nourishing the new growth. The earth, though changed, had regained its balance. It's remarkable to think that such destruction led to such renewal. The asteroid that ended the dinosaurs also cleared the ecological stage, removing the barriers that had kept other life forms small and hidden. The same event that had darkened the skies also opened them. The mammals and birds that inherited the world did not just survive the catastrophe, they were shaped by it. Their very existence was moulded by scarcity and resilience. The dawn after extinction was not only a return to light, but the beginning of innovation. Over the next few million years, the continents themselves continued to drift, slowly altering the shape of oceans and weather patterns. Mountain ranges formed, changing rainfall and temperature across vast regions. The shifting land created new habitats, dry plains, mountain valleys, and isolated islands where evolution worked independently. Diversity increased again. The planet was moving towards something new, something far more intricate than what had existed before. Each sunrise over that recovering world carried a sense of rebirth, though no creature was aware of it. The air was filled with the calls of birds, the rustling of leaves, the splash of water against stone. The silence that had once dominated the planet was gone. In its place came a steady murmur of life, the quiet, continuous noise of living things doing what they had always done: eating, growing, reproducing, dying. The earth had found its rhythm again. The plants continued to evolve alongside the animals. Flowering plants diversified into trees, shrubs, and vines, shaping the landscapes of the Paleogene. Forests became more structured, with layered canopies and complex interactions among species. Roots stabilized the soil, and decomposition renewed it. The planet's surface transformed from grey and barren to lush and living once again. Fossil pollen from this time shows a rapid increase in variety, evidence of ecosystems maturing within just a few thousand years after the end of the Cretaceous. The recovery of Earth was not uniform, but it was inevitable. Even in the harshest regions, life found a way to return. Volcanic plains became covered in mosses and lichens. Floodplains sprouted with reeds and grasses. Coastal swamps filled with amphibians and insects. The Earth, patient and indifferent, continued to create. The same forces that had built and destroyed the world countless times before were still at work, shaping the next chapter of its story. The dawn after extinction was, in truth, not a single moment, but an era. It stretched across millions of years, each generation carrying the planet a little further from its old life. The dinosaurs were gone, but their influence remained in the birds that filled the air and in the fossils that rested beneath the soil. The world they had ruled had not been erased. It had been transformed. Every new species, every returning plant, every breathing creature was part of the continuity that never truly ends. For the first time in its history, Earth was moving toward a balance that would allow for even greater complexity. The conditions that emerged from the chaos, the cooler climate, the rise of flowering plants, the diversification of mammals, were the groundwork for all that would follow. From this quiet new beginning would come the forests, the grasslands, the oceans, and eventually, the species capable of reflecting on the story itself. If you could have stood on one of those early Paleogene mornings, you would have seen a planet young again. The horizon would have been hazy with the warmth of a newly stable atmosphere. The air would smell of damp earth and vegetation. The calls of birds would echo across valleys where once there had been silence. The rivers would sparkle under the sunlight, carrying silt rich with the remains of the old world, feeding the roots of the new. It would not be a paradise, not yet, but it would be a beginning. The dawn after extinction was not the triumph of life over death. It was the continuity of a process that has no end. Creation, destruction, and renewal, cycling endlessly through time. The Earth did not mourn its losses, it simply moved forward. The survivors, unaware of their role in history, went on living. Their small victories, a nest built, a seed sprouting, a new generation born, were the steps through which the planet healed. Over millions of years, the forest grew dense again. The oceans sparkled with life. The air became rich and breathable. The Earth was whole once more, though not the same as before. It never is. Each age carries traces of those that came before it, built upon layers of memory pressed into stone. The dawn after extinction was one of those rare moments when the planet began anew, rewriting its surface, reinventing its inhabitants, and reminding itself of its own resilience. And still, through all of it, The Earth's pulse continued, deep beneath the crust, steady and eternal. The same pulse that had guided the formation of continents, the rise and fall of oceans, and the evolution of life. It had outlasted fire and ice, light and shadow, and it would continue long after the new forests had grown and fallen again. The dawn was only one in an infinite series, each following a night that once seemed endless. The world had survived. The air shimmered with light again. The seas reflected the sun. The soil breathed life into roots and leaves. The silence had passed, replaced by the soft murmur of life returning to the planet. The Earth, older now but no less alive, carried on, its surface warm again under the same sun that had once watched its destruction. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Cretaceous was quieter, but it was not empty. It was different in rhythm, smaller in scale and more intricate in its design. The age of giants had ended, yet their presence had not vanished. It lingered in the air, in the soil, in the DNA of the living things that followed. The echoes of those giants continued, woven into the biology of every creature that walked or flew or swam in the new world. The dinosaurs were gone, but their influence was not. The Earth still carried the memory of their footsteps. Everywhere, in subtle ways, their legacy was visible. The birds that filled the Paleogene skies were not merely descendants of dinosaurs, they were dinosaurs transformed by time. Their bones still carried the same hollow architecture that once lightened the bodies of flying predators. Their movements, their nesting behaviour, their calls, even their feathers, all traced back to those ancient forms. When they spread their wings against the sunlight, they were continuing a story that had begun long before the extinction. The skies had changed, but the creatures that ruled them were carrying forward the same genetic thread. On the ground, mammals filled the spaces left by the fallen titans, yet even they bore traces of what had come before. Evolution does not erase, it repurposes. The lungs, the circulatory systems, the metabolic engines that powered the new mammals were refined versions of mechanisms that had been tested for millions of years in the reptilian world. The flexibility that defined mammals, their ability to live in varied environments, to regulate temperature, to nurture their young, had been sculpted in part by the pressures left behind by the age of dinosaurs. The new rulers of the Earth were not replacements, they were continuations. As forests returned and climates stabilised, the Earth's surface began to look familiar again. The early Paleogene landscape was a mosaic of forests, rivers, wetlands and coastlines. The vegetation was dense but shorter, the trees younger, the ecosystems still finding equilibrium. The animals that roamed through them were smaller, but their activity was constant. Insects hummed in the air, small mammals rustled through the undergrowth, birds sang from branches, their songs thin but insistent. The scale of life had shrunk, yet the complexity had multiplied. The bones of the giants, buried beneath the soil, began to turn to stone. Layer after layer of sediment covered them, silt, sand, ash, pressing the memory of that age into permanence. Over millions of years, these remains became fossils, silent records of lives that had once shaped the planet. Each fossil was a fragment of the Earth's memory, a line in the long story of time. The giants could no longer be seen, but their forms endured beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered. In rivers and deltas, where water eroded rock, some of those bones became exposed again. Rain and wind uncovered shapes that had not seen light in 60 million years. Sometimes they broke apart, sometimes they remained hidden for ages longer. But slowly, as continents shifted and climates changed, the remnants of the Cretaceous began to surface. The planet, in its patient cycles, revealed its own history piece by piece. To the creatures of the Paleogene, these bones meant nothing. They grazed beside them, nested above them, walked over them without recognition. The Earth had no need to remember consciously. It carried its past in its layers, its chemistry, its continuity of life. The echoes of the giants were not sounds or sights, but structures and processes. the way plants evolved to support large herbivores that were no longer there, the way predators adapted to the memory of prey sizes that no longer existed. Even absence leaves an imprint. The planet had adapted to the scale of the dinosaurs, and in their absence, it was adjusting again. The oceans bore traces of that age too. Coral reefs, once nearly destroyed, began to grow again over the limestone remains of older ecosystems. The shells of ammonites, the coiled mollusks that had ruled the seas for millions of years, were gone, but their design lived on in the shapes of other creatures. Nautiluses, squid, the intricate spirals that nature continued to favour. The patterns of evolution repeated themselves with variations, echoing what had worked before. Every new adaptation, every evolutionary experiment seemed to carry faint reminders of what had preceded it. In the skeletons of mammals, in the wings of birds, in the scales of reptiles, there were hints of forms that had vanished. Evolution was not a straight line, but a series of echoes, each generation reshaping what had been left behind, refining and rediscovering it in new ways. The echoes of the giants were not only physical, they existed in the rhythms of the planet itself. The carbon and calcium of their bones became part of the rocks and oceans, feeding new chemical cycles. The forests that grew over their remains drew nutrients from their decomposing bodies, turning death into soil and soil into growth. Every living thing that rose afterward was, in a literal sense, built from the remains of what came before. The atoms that once made up a tyrannosaur might, millions of years later, have become part of a tree, a mammal, or a bird. The Earth reused everything. Nothing was lost, only transformed. As time passed, new giants appeared, though none quite like those that had come before. Some mammals grew massive, the ancestors of elephants, whales, and ground sloths. They filled ecological spaces that had been empty since the extinction. But the world that allowed them to exist was different. The air was cooler, the oxygen levels lower, the climate more variable. The balance that had sustained the dinosaurs no longer existed. These new titans were smaller, slower, and fewer. The age of planetary-scale gigantism was over. The Earth had entered an age of moderation. Yet the memory of scale persisted in nature's imagination. Evolution, though constrained by new conditions, continued to produce creatures of remarkable size and complexity. The whales, descending from small land mammals, returned to the sea and grew larger than even the greatest dinosaurs. The elephants filled the land with their slow, deliberate movements, shaping vegetation and soil in ways reminiscent of the sauropods. The pattern had changed, but the echo remained. Life still tested the limits of size, of endurance, of form. Millions of years later, the first primates appeared in the forests, small, curious creatures with forward-facing eyes and agile hands. They lived in trees, feeding on fruit, navigating the complex architecture of branches and leaves. They had no awareness of the ancient world beneath them, no concept of the ages that had preceded their existence. But their presence, like everything else, was part of the same unbroken story. They too were descendants of survivors, shaped by the world that the giants had left behind. The echoes of the dinosaurs extended even into the planet's atmosphere. The oxygen they had helped regulate through their impact on vegetation and carbon cycles had altered the chemistry of the air. Their bones, buried deep, contributed to the slow formation of fossil fuels that would one day influence climates again. Their extinction had reshaped ecosystems so profoundly that the path of evolution itself had changed course. Every living thing that followed bore the invisible fingerprints of their presence and disappearance. To the Earth, this was simply another turn in an endless cycle. Species rose, dominated, vanished, and were replaced. The details changed, but the pattern did not. Each extinction created space for new life. Each resurgence carried traces of what had come before. The planet was not sentimental, it was procedural, following the rules of chemistry and physics, guided by the slow logic of natural selection. The giants had come and gone, but their energy remained part of the system. The continents continued to move, their shapes shifting slowly across the globe. Mountains rose and eroded, oceans widened and narrowed, the air cooled, then warmed, then cooled again. Through it all, the echoes persisted, not as sounds but as consequences. The ecosystems of the Paleogene, and those that followed in the Neogene and Quaternary, were living continuations of the Mesozoic blueprint. The relationships between predator and prey, between plant and pollinator, between land and sea, were all extensions of patterns first written in the time of the dinosaurs. When humans eventually appeared, millions of years later, they too were shaped by those same forces. The structure of their bones, the organization of their lungs, the balance of their hormones, all inherited from lineages that had survived the long night after the Cretaceous. Even their curiosity, their tendency to explore, to observe, to remember, could be traced back to the same evolutionary pressures that rewarded awareness and adaptation. Humanity's rise was not separate from the dinosaurs' fall. It was one more echo in the same vast continuum, and when people began to dig into the ground, unearthing the fossilized bones of creatures they could scarcely imagine, the echoes became voices again. The stone skeletons spoke of a time when the world was ruled by beings so immense and strange that they seemed impossible. Their discovery connected two distant ages, the present and the ancient past, through curiosity and wonder. The giants, long gone, returned to the imagination of the species that would one day study them. Museums filled with their remains. Names were given: Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Brachiosaurus, Ankylosaurus. Their images appeared in art, in books, in the minds of children who could not yet comprehend timescales but understood awe. The echoes had travelled through stone and memory, becoming part of human culture. The giants had left more than bones. They had left stories, questions, and an enduring sense of scale. The Earth, of course, continued without pause. It did not know that one of its later species would remember the dinosaurs, reconstruct their lives, and find in them a reflection of itself. The planet kept turning. Seasons came and went. Species appeared and vanished. Volcanoes erupted. Ice ages arrived and receded. The same slow, indifferent processes that had once ended the dinosaurs now shaped everything that followed. But in the minds of those who studied the past, the echoes grew louder. The fossils were not just stones. They were reminders of continuity. In every feather that lifts on the wind, there is a trace of that ancient world. In every bird song at dawn, there is the faintest resonance of the Cretaceous forests. The warm blood of mammals carries within it the same biological ingenuity that once powered the bodies of the great reptiles. The ecosystems that surround us, the forests, the plains, the oceans, are all built upon foundations laid by those giants. Their extinction was not an ending, but a transformation. Their legacy was not silence, but complexity. Every movement of life since then has been a continuation of their world in miniature. A world still guided by the same forces, still pulsing with the same energy, still carrying the same persistence that allowed life to survive the worst of nights. The echoes of giants remain everywhere, in the rocks beneath our feet, in the air we breathe, in the lineage of every creature that moves today. They remind us that time does not erase, it reshapes. The world that was theirs became ours not through conquest, but through inheritance. The Earth does not belong to one age or one kind of life. It simply holds whatever survives long enough to live upon it. And somewhere, deep below the forests and mountains, beneath layers of stone and fossil, the bones of the giants still rest. Their weight is part of the planet now, their stories locked within its geology, their echoes carried forward in the pulse of everything still alive. The Earth moves on, slow and eternal, carrying its memories quietly. A world still whispering with the presence of those who came before. The echoes never fade, they only change form. The world turns beneath the same stars that once watched the giants walk. The continents, shaped and reshaped by time, still carry their traces. The air that fills your lungs now once passed through the leaves of the Cretaceous forests. The calcium in your bones was born in the same oceans where the ammonites once floated. Every breath, every heartbeat, every sound of wind through trees is part of the same unbroken chain that began long before any eyes looked toward the sky and wondered. The Earth has seen endless beginnings and endings. It has burned, frozen, fractured and healed. It has been covered in forests and ice, ruled by reptiles and birds, mammals and insects. And through it all, the same pulse has never stopped, the quiet rhythm that carries life forward, even through catastrophe. The story of the dinosaurs is only one verse in a song that has been playing for 4.5 billion years. Somewhere tonight, far from cities and light, the air still carries the same weight it did in the time of the giants. The night sky arches overhead, filled with ancient light, the glow of stars that outlived everything that ever walked this world. If you close your eyes and breathe slowly, you can almost feel it. The long memory of the planet, the deep continuity that runs through rock and air and living things alike. It isn't about extinction or even survival. It's about persistence, the quiet endurance of life in all its fragile and stubborn forms. The knowledge that even after the fire, after the dark, after the silence, something always returns. Something small, something unseen, something patient. The fern that grows in ash, the bird that sings after winter. The world never ends completely. It changes, waits, and begins again. The giants are gone, but their echoes remain all around you, in every leaf that unfurls, in every drop of water that falls back to the sea, in the hum of insects, in the shadows that move across the ground, in the warmth that rises with morning light. Their world became ours. Their time became our time. The same sunlight that once touched their scales now touches your skin. The same gravity that carried their steps now carries yours. So when you breathe, you are breathing with them. When you sleep, you're resting in the same long cycle they once did, under the same stars, on the same ground, within the same unfolding story. The dinosaurs may have vanished from sight, but the planet that shaped them still turns, slowly, steadily, endlessly. And as you listen now, the earth is still moving beneath you. The air is still shifting, quiet and patient. Somewhere in the dark, the sea is still breathing against the shore. Somewhere deep inside the planet, heat still flows from its core. Everything that was continues in different forms, in different rhythms. Nothing has truly disappeared. You can close your eyes now and let it all fade. The ancient forests, the seas, the shadows of titans walking through sunlight millions of years ago. Let the sound of their world dissolve into the quiet of this one. The earth has seen so much, and yet tonight it is still here, turning as it always has, carrying everything it has ever been. Breathe with it, slow, steady. The same rhythm as the planet beneath you, the same pulse that began before time had a name and will go on long after. The giants are gone. The world remains, and in its silence, they are still here, not as fossils, not as memory, but as part of everything that is. Good night.